Hey, welcome back. Grab your blanket, get comfortable, and just breathe for a second. Because tonight I want to take you somewhere most people have never really thought about. Imagine walking into a city, a full living city, and finding the bread still warm in the oven, the wine still sitting on the table, sandals left by the door like someone was just about to step outside. But no one is there. No one ever came back. Now imagine that city stayed that way for 1700 years. That is not fiction. That actually happened. And it happened not once, but dozens of times across the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen. So tonight we're asking one of the most quietly haunting questions in all of human history. How does a civilization, one that built roads still used today, aqueducts that carried water across mountain ranges, cities with indoor plumbing before most of the world even had permanent walls, how does something like that just stop? Let me paint you a picture first, because I think it helps to really feel the scale of what we're talking about. At its peak, the Roman Empire stretched from the misty shores of northern Britain all the way down to the sun-baked sands of what is now Morocco. It reached east into modern-day Iraq and west to the Atlantic coast of Portugal. We are talking about roughly 5 million square kilometres of land under one government, one legal system, one network of roads, and most importantly, one idea that civilization was something you could build, export and sustain. And the Romans were very, very good at building things. They built over 400,000 kilometres of road. That is enough to circle the earth more than 9 times. They built cities in the middle of deserts, on the edges of cliffs, in swamps, and in places that by any reasonable modern standard should never have had cities at all. They had heated floors, actual underfloor heating, called a hypercore system 2,000 years before central heating became common in Europe. So when I tell you that many of these cities simply vanished, I want you to sit with how strange that is. Not invaded and burned dramatically overnight, not swept away by a single earthquake, but emptied, slowly, quietly, like a fire going out one ember at a time. Here's something that always gets me personally. We tend to think of civilizations falling the way Hollywood shows it, armies storming through gates, fires everywhere, a dramatic last stand. And yes, some Roman cities did end that way, but most of them did not. Most of them ended in something far more unsettling: abandonment. People just left. One family at a time, one season at a time. The aqueducts stopped being maintained. Then the water pressure dropped. Then the public baths closed. Then the market got smaller. Then the wealthy merchants moved away. Then the craftsmen had no customers. Then the soldiers were reassigned. And one day, not with a bang but with a long, slow exhale, the city became a memory. There is something in that pattern that feels uncomfortably familiar if you think about it. But we will get to that. Tonight we're going to walk through some of the most remarkable abandoned cities of the Roman world, and I promise you, each one has a story that will surprise you. We will visit Pompeii, obviously, but not the tourist brochure version. We are going to stand in the actual streets, at the actual moment everything stopped, and think about what the archaeologists found that no documentary has ever really sat with long enough. We will go to a place called Timgad, in what is now Algeria, a city so perfectly designed, so mathematically precise, that when the desert finally covered it in sand and it was rediscovered in 1875, explorers thought someone was playing a joke on them. A Roman grid city, in the middle of the Sahara, completely intact and completely empty. We will visit Leptis Magna in modern Libya, arguably the most spectacular Roman ruins on earth, built by an emperor who grew up there and spent his personal fortune turning it into something extraordinary. And we will ask why that same devotion may have been the thing that doomed it. We will follow the strange story of Londinium, yes, the city that eventually became London, and what happened the day Rome essentially sent a letter saying very politely, "You are on your own now." The population of that city dropped from roughly 60,000 people to somewhere near zero within a generation. And the wild part, they had nowhere to run. They just faded. And we will end somewhere even more unexpected, a city in Morocco called Volubilis, where the Roman Empire officially ended in the West in 476 Anno Domini, and nobody told the people still living there. They kept speaking Latin. They kept using Roman law. They kept calling themselves Romans for another 200 years, alone. Now, before we dive in, I want to say something that I think is actually the most important thing about all of these stories. The question is not really what destroyed Rome. Historians have been arguing about that for centuries. There are literally over 210 proposed explanations in the academic literature, ranging from lead poisoning in the water pipes to moral decay to climate change to simple bad luck. And honestly, they are all probably a little bit right. The more interesting question, the one that keeps me up at night, is this. What does it feel like to live in a civilization that is ending and not know it? Because the people of Pompeii did not know that morning was their last morning. The merchants of Timgad did not know the last trade caravan was the last. The citizens of Londinium did not know that when the last Roman administrator sailed back across the channel, no one would ever come to replace him. They just kept living, baking bread, raising children, making plans for next year. And that, I think, is what makes these stories feel less like ancient history and more like a mirror. Because every civilization in every era tends to assume it will last forever. Rome was no different. And in many ways, that assumption, that unshakable confidence in the permanence of what they had built, may have been one of the reasons they were so slow to see the cracks forming beneath their feet. There is one more thing I want to plant in your mind before we start this journey together. When archaeologists excavated the ruins of a Roman city in what is now Tunisia, a place called Duga, they found something in the public forum, the town square, that has stuck with me ever since I read about it. Carved into the stone pavement, worn smooth by centuries of feet, were grooves. Grooves from market stalls, evidence of commerce, of daily life, of ordinary people doing ordinary things in the centre of a city that had no idea its world was about to shrink into silence. Those grooves are still there today. The people who made them are long gone. The empire they lived inside has been dust for 1,500 years. But those marks in the stone, they're still there. And that is the thing about Roman cities. Even the ones that stopped, even the ones swallowed by sand or jungle or time, they have this quiet insistence on being remembered. They refuse to fully disappear. So let us go find them. Let us start with the most famous and maybe the most misunderstood Roman city of all time. A city that did not slowly fade, did not quietly empty out, but was cut off from history in a single violent morning. A morning that began like any other, with bread in the oven, wine on the table, and a mountain that nobody was watching closely enough. So close your eyes for just a moment. Picture a warm summer morning, the kind where the air already feels heavy before the sun gets too high, and everyone in the market is moving a little slower than usual because of the heat. Vendors are calling out prices. Children are chasing each other between the columns of the forum. Someone is laughing too loudly at a joke you did not quite catch. It is August the 24th in the year 79 according to the Common Era. And in a bakery on the western side of a city called Pompeii, a man named Modestus has just slid 81 loaves of bread into his stone oven. He will never take them out. I want to spend some real time here because Pompeii is one of those places that everyone thinks they know, and almost no one actually does. We have all seen the photos, the ruins, the columns, the plaster casts of people frozen in their final moments. It has become almost too familiar, like a postcard you have looked at so many times the image stops meaning anything. But strip all of that away, and what you have is a city of approximately 11,000 people who woke up one morning with no idea that they were living the last day of their lives. And the details, the small, ordinary, heartbreaking details, are what make Pompeii unlike any other place on Earth. Let me give you the morning as best we can reconstruct it. Vesuvius, the mountain looming just 8 kilometers to the north, had been showing signs of unrest for years. There had been a significant earthquake 16 years earlier, in 62 of the Common Era, that damaged large parts of the city. The Romans knew the mountain was strange. They just did not know what that strangeness meant because no one in recorded Western history had ever witnessed a volcanic eruption of this kind before. The word volcano did not even exist yet. They called Vesuvius a mountain, just a mountain. So when it began sometime around 1 in the afternoon, according to the most widely accepted reconstruction, the initial reaction in Pompeii was probably more confusion than panic. A column of ash and rock shot upward into the sky, reaching an estimated 33 kilometers high. Pliny the Younger, a 17-year-old boy watching from the town of Misenum across the bay, described it as looking like a massive umbrella pine tree, a trunk of dark cloud rising and then spreading wide at the top. He wrote about it in letters that survived, and those letters remain one of the most extraordinary pieces of eyewitness historical writing we have from the ancient world. Most people in Pompeii probably thought they had time, and for a few hours they did. The first wave was ash and pumice, small lightweight volcanic stones raining down on the city. Roofs began to collapse under the weight. People grabbed what they could and ran. Others huddled in cellars waiting for it to pass. Some tied pillows over their heads. We know this because archaeologists found them that way. But then in the early hours of the following morning everything changed. The eruption entered a new phase. A pyroclastic surge, a superheated avalanche of gas ash and rock, moving at speeds of up to 300 kilometers per hour, and at temperatures around 300 degrees Celsius, swept down the mountainside. And when it reached Pompeii, it did not give anyone time to react. The city stopped at that exact moment like a clock with a broken spring, and it stayed stopped for 1700 years. Now here is where I want to slow down because this is the part that documentaries always rush past. When archaeologists began seriously excavating Pompeii in the 18th century, the formal excavations began under the direction of Rocco Alcubierre. In 1748, commissioned by the King of Naples, they started finding things that genuinely disturbed them. Not because the ruins were gruesome, but because they were so normal. They found a pot of lentil soup still sitting over an old hearth. They found a bronze surgeon's kit, every instrument neatly arranged as if the surgeon had just stepped out and planned to return. They found a wine shop with 16 ceramic jars still sealed, still containing traces of wine. They found a fast food counter, and the Romans absolutely had fast food called a thermopolium, with the food remnants still in the serving wells. And in Modestus's bakery they found those 81 loaves of bread, still in the oven, carbonized black as coal but perfectly preserved in shape. You could hold one in your hands today and see the score marks the baker made in the dough, the exact weight of each loaf, the stamp identifying which bakery it came from. Modestus had a routine. He baked the same bread in the same oven in the same neighborhood probably for years. And on that particular morning his routine just ended. Does that not get to you just a little? But what I find even more striking, and this is something that genuinely shifted how I think about this place, is not what the archaeologists found in the buildings. It is what they found in the streets. In 1863, an Italian archaeologist named Giuseppe Fiorelli developed a technique that changed everything. He noticed that the ash had hardened around the bodies of the victims, creating hollow spaces in the shape of the people who had died. By carefully pouring plaster into those voids, he could recreate the exact posture, the exact expression, the exact final moment of each person. What he found was not what anyone expected. Many of the people did not look afraid. They looked tired, resigned. Some were curled on their sides in positions that suggested they had simply lain down and waited. A group of 13 people, now known as the Garden of the Fugitives, were found clustered together at the edge of the city as if they had almost made it out. Almost. There was a woman found with a child beside her, a man who had apparently covered his face with his cloak. 2 people holding each other, their arms still wrapped around one another after 2 millennia. And then there was the dog. In the house of Vesonius Primus, they found a dog still chained near the entrance, a guard dog that someone in all the chaos either forgot or could not free in time. The plaster cast shows the animal twisted its legs, raised evidence that it had spent its final moments trying to escape. That particular cast has been in museums and history books for over 150 years, and it still makes people stop walking and just stare. I think it is because the dog, more than anything else, makes it feel real. Kings and armies and political systems are easy to hold at a distance. But a dog left behind that lands differently. Here is the thing about Pompeii that historians sometimes gloss over. Approximately 2,000 bodies have been found in the city so far. But the estimated population was around 11,000 people, which means roughly 9,000 people got out. They ran. They survived. They went on to live their lives somewhere else, carrying the memory of what they had seen. And then over the following centuries they forgot. Their children forgot. Their grandchildren never knew the city existed. The ash hardened, the soil covered it, vines grew, and the world moved on. By the Middle Ages, the ruins were so completely buried that the land was being farmed. People were growing vegetables directly on top of a lost city without any idea it was there. That is the part that quietly stuns me every time I come back to it. Pompeii was not hidden in some remote corner of the world. It was in the middle of one of the most densely inhabited regions of Europe, and it still disappeared from memory for 17 centuries. It makes you wonder in the most uncomfortable way what else might be right beneath our feet that we simply have not thought to look for. Now you might be thinking, okay, Pompeii makes sense as a city that stopped. A volcano is a pretty hard argument to win, but what about the cities that had no volcano, no earthquake, no fire, no single catastrophic morning? What about the cities that just quietly emptied out for reasons no one can point to on a single day of a single year? That is where our next stop takes us. And I have to warn you, this one is somehow even stranger than Pompeii, because at least Pompeii had an excuse. The city we are heading to next was buried not by fire, but by something far slower, and in some ways far more patient. Sand. Actually, before the sand gets its turn, and trust me, that story is coming, there is one more shadow we need to stand in. One more city that shared the same mountain, the same morning, and the same fate as Pompeii. And yet somehow almost no one talks about it. Maybe because it is harder to see, harder to walk through, harder in every sense of the word to reach. The city is called Herculaneum, and in some ways what happened there on that same August morning is even more extraordinary than what happened in Pompeii, and far, far stranger. Let me give you some geography first, because it matters. Pompeii sat about 8 kilometers southeast of Vesuvius. Herculaneum was less than 4 kilometers to the west, practically at the foot of the mountain. It was smaller, wealthier, more refined. If Pompeii was a busy commercial port city with all the noise and mess that comes with that, Herculaneum was more like a seaside retreat for the Roman upper class. Think of it as the difference between a working harbour town and a quiet coastal village where rich families kept their summer homes. The population was somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 people. The streets were narrower, the houses were larger, there were elaborate mosaic floors, private gardens, marble fountains. Several properties are believed to have belonged to members of Rome's aristocratic class, and at least one, the famous Villa of the Perpieri, may have been connected to the family of Julius Caesar's father-in-law. Archaeologists have been debating that last part for decades, but even the possibility of it tells you something about the caliber of people who lived here. It was by any measure a beautiful place to live, which makes what happened to it all the more striking. Here is the part that changes how you think about the whole eruption. When Vesuvius exploded on August the 24th, the ashen pumice that buried Pompeii largely fell to the southeast, carried by the wind. Herculaneum, being to the west, initially received far less of the ashfall. For the first several hours of the eruption, the people of Herculaneum had more time and arguably more warning than the people of Pompeii did. Many of them made it to the beach. This is where the story takes a turn that I still find genuinely hard to sit with. At the edge of the ancient shoreline, the waterfront that was eventually buried and is now about 400 meters from the modern coast, because the eruption added that much new land. Archaeologists in the 1980s discovered a series of stone boathouses, arched chambers built into the seafront wall used for storing fishing boats and equipment. Inside those chambers they found approximately 300 people. They had gathered there waiting for boats to come and rescue them. The Roman fleet, under the command of Pliny the Elder, the uncle of the same young man who watched the eruption from across the bay, had actually launched a rescue mission. Pliny the Elder himself sailed toward the eruption trying to reach survivors. He made it to a nearby town called Stabiae but could not reach Herculaneum. He died there, likely from the toxic gases, making him possibly the most famous victim of the eruption that most people have never heard of. The people in those boathouses did not know that. They waited looking out at the water watching for sails, and then the pyroclastic surge reached them. Now this is the part where Herculaneum and Pompeii diverge in ways that are scientifically astonishing, and I think it is worth slowing down here. A pyroclastic surge is not simply hot air. It is a moving wall of superheated gas, volcanic ash, and rock fragments, dense, fast, and almost incomprehensibly lethal. The surge that reached Herculaneum in the early hours of August the 25th is estimated to have travelled at speeds of up to 100 kilometers per hour and reached temperatures of somewhere between 300 and 500 degrees Celsius at ground level. For the people in the boathouses, death was essentially instantaneous. Studies of the skeletal remains, and unlike Pompeii, Herculaneum preserved actual bones rather than ash voids, because the volcanic material was different, found evidence of extreme thermal shock. The muscle tissue and skin evaporated. Red blood cell residue was found in some of the skulls, suggesting the blood literally boiled in place. And then in 2020, a team of researchers published a study that genuinely stopped the scientific community in its tracks. They found that the extreme heat had vitrified the brain of one of the victims. Vitrified as in turned to glass. The brain matter, subjected to temperatures of around 500 degrees Celsius and then rapidly cooled by the volcanic ash, had transformed into a black glassy solid. Actual human brain tissue preserved for nearly 2,000 years as a kind of dark crystal. I remember reading about that discovery and just sitting with it for a long minute. There is something almost unbearable about that detail. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just quiet and strange and final in a way that is hard to articulate. But here is the other thing about Herculaneum that does not get nearly enough attention. Because the city was buried not under loose ash and pumice like Pompeii, but under a dense flow of volcanic material that eventually hardened into rock up to 20 meters thick, the preservation conditions were completely different. Organic materials, wood rope, food, fabric survived in Herculaneum in ways they simply did not in Pompeii. Wooden bed frames, wooden doors still on their hinges, a wooden cradle, ropes, grain, eggs, the remains of a boat remarkably well preserved found near the shore. And then there is the library, the villa of the papyri, the large aristocratic house that gave the city its most extraordinary legacy, contained approximately 1,800 carbonized papyrus scrolls. They were found in the 18th century, and at first no one knew what to do with them. They looked like lumps of charcoal. Early attempts to unroll them destroyed many. The ones that survived sat mostly unread for centuries. Think about that for a moment. 1,800 scrolls. In a world where the vast majority of ancient literature has been permanently lost, where we know that works by Aristotle, Sappho, Euripides, and countless others existed but are gone forever, here was an actual ancient library buried under a volcano waiting. And now, thanks to modern technology, specifically a technique called X-ray phase contrast tomography, which can essentially read the ink on rolled-up scrolls without physically unrolling them, researchers are finally right now in our lifetime beginning to read them. In 2023 and 2024, a competition called the Vesuvius Challenge offered prizes for successfully deciphering portions of the scrolls using artificial intelligence and imaging technology, and teams around the world began making real breakthroughs. We are at this very moment in history recovering lost words from a library that has been underground since the year 79. If that does not give you chills, I honestly do not know what to tell you. Here is the personal observation I keep coming back to with Herculaneum. Pompeii is the city we mourn. It is the one with the plaster cast, the famous bakery, the garden of the fugitives. It has a kind of visual drama that makes it easy to feel, but Herculaneum is the city that quietly astonishes. It is buried deeper, harder to excavate, less visited. Only about 4 city blocks out of an estimated original 20 have been uncovered so far. The rest sits under the modern town of Ercolano inaccessible without demolishing the homes and streets of people living there today, which means that beneath someone's apartment building, beneath a parking lot, beneath a road that cars drive down every single day, there is a Roman city still waiting to be found. Most of it has never been seen since the morning it disappeared. The things we do not know about Herculaneum almost certainly outnumber the things we do, and in some strange way that feels right for a city that spent 1,700 years keeping its secrets in the dark. Both Pompeii and Herculaneum stopped on the same morning. Same volcano, same eruption, same sky turning black, but they stopped differently. They preserved differently. They are teaching us different things even now, 2,000 years later, which if you think about it is a pretty good reminder that even in the middle of the same catastrophe, the details of how you lived and where you stood can change everything about what gets left behind. And speaking of what gets left behind, the next city we are visiting left behind something that to this day makes archaeologists do a double take the first time they see it. Because no one expects to find a Roman grid city this perfectly intact, and certainly not in the place where it was found. Let us head to the desert. Right then, the desert. I want you to picture something for a moment. You're a French military officer stationed in northern Algeria in the year 1875. You're out on a survey expedition in the high plains of the Aure Mountains about 480 kilometers southeast of Algiers at an elevation of around 1,000 meters. The landscape is harsh, dry, and largely empty. You're not expecting to find anything particularly remarkable. And then rising out of the scrub and the dust you see a triumphal arch. A full Roman triumphal arch, intact, still standing, in the middle of the Sahara. You look closer. Behind it, barely visible under centuries of accumulated soil and desert debris, there are streets. Actual streets laid out in a perfect grid. There are columns, a forum, a theatre, public baths, a library, temple foundations, all of it arranged with a geometric precision that looks less like something that grew organically over time, and more like someone sat down with a ruler and a very strong opinion about right angles. The officer's name was Robert Bruno, and his report back to the French colonial authorities essentially said, "You need to come see this." Because I am not sure I believe it myself, what he had stumbled onto was Timgad, and to this day it remains one of the most perfectly preserved and perfectly strange Roman cities ever found. To understand why Timgad exists at all, you have to understand something about how Rome thought about civilization. For the Romans, building a city was not just a practical act, it was a statement. It was Rome saying, "We were here, we organized this space, we imposed order on chaos, and this place is now part of us." The Emperor Trajan, one of the most capable administrators Rome ever produced, and the man who expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, founded Timgad in the year 100 of the Common Era. The full official name was Colonia Marciana Ulpia Traiana Thamugadi, which is quite a mouthful, and which I imagine the locals shortened to something considerably more manageable within about a week. Its original purpose was military. Trajan established it as a colony for veterans of the 3rd Augustan Legion soldiers who had served their time and were being given land and a place to settle. The legion itself was stationed nearby at a fortress called Lambesis, about 18 kilometers away, and Timgad was essentially their retirement community, which I have to say is a remarkably civilized concept for an empire that is often remembered primarily for its armies. The city was designed from scratch all at once according to the standard Roman military camp layout, a grid of streets intersecting at perfect right angles, with a central forum at the heart of everything. The original planned area covered roughly 12.5 hectares. Every block was the same size, every street was the same width. The whole thing looked from above like a blueprint that has been directly transferred to the ground. And here is what makes a Roman military architect different from, say, a civilian city planner. They did not leave room for improvisation. Everything had its place before the first stone was laid. But here is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because Timgad did not stay a small military retirement colony. It grew. Over the following 2 centuries, the city expanded far beyond its original boundaries. The population eventually reached somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 people, a substantial city by ancient standards. New neighborhoods sprawled outside the original grid, less orderly, more organic, the way cities actually grow when real people start living in them and making their own decisions about where to put things. At its peak, Timgad had 14 public baths. 14. For a city of 15,000 people, that is a remarkable ratio, and it tells you something about how central the Roman bathing culture was to daily life, not just for hygiene, but for socializing, doing business, and simply passing the time. The city also had a capital temple, a theatre with a capacity of around 3,500 seats, a public library that is one of the best preserved in the entire Roman world, a market, multiple fountains, and a forum ringed with columns. There was also famously an inscription carved into the stone near the entrance of the forum. Translated roughly from Latin, it reads, "To hunt, to bathe, to play, to laugh, that is to live." I genuinely love that inscription, because it tells you that these people soldiers turned settlers living at the edge of the empire in the middle of the Ore Plateau had figured something out about what a good life actually looks like. They were not being ironic. They meant it. And honestly, 2,000 years later, it is hard to argue with them. Now let us talk about why Timgad disappeared. Because this is where the story shifts from impressive Roman achievement to something more complicated. The city's decline was not sudden. It happened in layers like most of the stories we're exploring tonight. In the 5th century of the Common Era, the region was raided by a Berber confederation known as the Luata. There is evidence of significant destruction from that period. Burnt buildings, disrupted infrastructure. The city survived, but it was weakened. Then in 535 of the Common Era, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I sent his general Solomon to reconquer the region from the Vandals who had taken over much of North Africa. The Byzantines rebuilt parts of Timgad, constructed a fortress on the western edge of the city, and tried to restore some degree of order. For a while it seemed to work, but the Byzantines were stretched thin. They were fighting wars on multiple fronts simultaneously against the Persians in the east, against the Ostrogoths in Italy, against various groups across North Africa. Maintaining a city in the high Algerian plains was not exactly the top of the priority list in Constantinople. And then in the 7th century of the Common Era, the Arab conquest swept across North Africa with remarkable speed. By around 688 of the Common Era, the region had changed hands decisively and permanently. Timgad by that point had already been largely abandoned. The last residents drifted away. The buildings were not demolished. There was no dramatic final battle here, no burning, no dramatic last stand. People simply stopped living there. The roofs collapsed over time. The soil crept in. The desert, slow and patient as always, did the rest. By the medieval period, the city was completely buried. The Berber communities of the region knew vaguely that something old was under the ground in that area. There are local traditions that reference buried ruins, but no one knew the scale of what lay beneath. For roughly 12 centuries, Timgad sat under the earth, perfectly preserved in the dry mountain air, waiting. Here is what I find most thought-provoking about Timgad, and it is something I have turned over in my mind many times. The city was designed to be perfect, truly deliberately mathematically perfect. Every street the same width, every block the same size, every public building in its assigned place, according to a plan drawn up before anyone had moved in. It was Rome's idea of an ideal city made physical, and yet the parts of Timgad that feel most alive when you walk through the ruins today, if you ever get the chance, and I really hope you do, are not the perfectly planned sections. They are the chaotic neighbourhoods that grew up outside the original grid. The ones where people built their houses at slight angles, where the streets curve a little, where you can tell that actual human beings with actual different priorities were making actual different decisions about how they wanted to live. The perfect grid is impressive, but the messy outskirts are where you can feel the city breathing. I think there is a lesson buried in that somewhere about the difference between a plan for civilization and civilization itself. But I will leave you to draw your own conclusions on that one. What the rediscovery of Timgad in 1875 actually gave the world was something extraordinary. A Roman city that had not been picked apart over the centuries, for building materials had not been built over, had not been modified and repurposed beyond recognition. Because it was buried in a place remote enough that no one had bothered, the original structure survived with a completeness that is almost unmatched anywhere else in the Roman world. The triumphal arch that Robert Bruno saw rising from the scrub. It is known today as the Arch of Trajan, and it stands 27 meters tall. It was not restored, not reconstructed. It was simply there, waiting the way it had been since the 2nd century of the Common Era. UNESCO designated Timgad a World Heritage Site in 1982. And yet if you asked 100 people on the street in any American or European city to name a famous Roman ruin, almost none of them would say Timgad. They would say the Colosseum. They might say Pompeii. They might say the Forum in Rome. But Timgad, a city more complete than almost any of those sitting at the edge of the Sahara, carved with an inscription about hunting and laughing and bathing, as the definition of a good life remains one of history's best kept secrets. Which in a strange way feels appropriate. Some of the most extraordinary things in the world are the ones no one thought to look for. But if Timgad is the Roman city that surprises you with its perfection, the next city on our journey surprises you with something different entirely. It surprises you with its ambition, and then quietly with what that ambition ultimately cost. Because the next city we visit was not built by an emperor trying to house his soldiers. It was built by an emperor trying to prove something to the world. Something personal, something that had everything to do with where he came from, and very little to do with what the empire actually needed. And the result was one of the most spectacular cities in all of Roman North Africa, and one of the loneliest ruins on earth. There is a particular kind of pride that only makes sense if you have ever left somewhere behind. Not abandoned it, but outgrown it, moved on, climbed so far up that when you look back down the place you came from looks impossibly small against everything you have become. And then somewhere deep in that complicated feeling there is this quiet, persistent pull to go back, to prove something, to take everything the world gave you and pour it back into the ground where you first drew breath. Septimius Severus knew that feeling better than almost anyone in Roman history, and what he did with it produced one of the most staggering cities the ancient world ever saw. The city was called Leptis Magna, and if you have never heard of it, I promise you that is about to change. Let us start with the man himself, because without understanding Severus, Leptis Magna makes no sense at all. Lucius Septimius. Severus was born in Leptis Magna in the year 145 of the Common Era. His family was of Punic and Berber descent, North African through and through, from a prosperous provincial family that had done well under Roman rule. He was educated, ambitious, and possessed of a personality that contemporary sources describe as simultaneously generous and terrifyingly ruthless, which, to be fair, describes most successful Roman emperors. He worked his way up through the military and political ranks, with methodical determination, serving as a soldier, a legal officer, a provincial governor. He learned how power worked from the inside. He watched emperors make mistakes. He took notes. And then in the year 193 of the Common Era, the Emperor Pertinax was assassinated after a reign of just 87 days, and the empire descended into a period of crisis known as the Year of the Five Emperors. One of those chapters of Roman history that reads less like political succession and more like a very violent game of musical chairs. Severus moved fast. He marched his Danubian legions on Rome, outmaneuvered his rivals, and by the end of that chaotic year he was emperor. The first African-born emperor Rome ever had. Let that land for a moment. A man born in what is now the coastal city of Al-Qums in modern Libya, from a family with roots that predated Roman arrival in North Africa, now sat at the absolute apex of Western civilization. In terms of sheer upward mobility, it is one of the most remarkable trajectories in ancient history, and he never forgot where he came from. When Severus turned his attention to Leptis Magna, which he did with considerable focus and considerable money, the city was already prosperous. It had been a major trading port for centuries, sitting on the North African coast, at a naturally sheltered harbour positioned perfectly to handle the flow of goods between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean world. Ivory, gold, wild animals for the Roman game slaves' olive oil, All of it passed through Leptis Magna. But prosperous and magnificent are two different things, and Severus wanted magnificent. The building program he launched around the year 200 of the Common Era was by any measure extraordinary. He did not renovate Leptis Magna. He essentially rebuilt it from the ground up at imperial expense with the finest materials and craftsmen the empire could supply. The new forum he commissioned, now known as the Severan Forum, covered an area of roughly 100 by 60 meters, surrounded on three sides by a colonnade of granite and marble columns, the capitals carved with intricate reliefs of Medusa heads and vine scrolls. The basilica at its end, the judicial and civic hall, had a nave flanked by two apses and columns of Egyptian granite rising to heights that dwarfed almost anything else in Roman North Africa. There was a new harbour engineered and enlarged to handle the increased maritime traffic that Severus anticipated. A new colonnaded street, one of the grandest in the entire Roman world, stretching from the harbour through the heart of the city. A lighthouse, new temples, an expanded theatre, and the arch. The four-faced triumphal arch erected at the intersection of the city's two main roads, covered in elaborate carved panels depicting the imperial family military victories and religious ceremonies. It was finished around 203 of the Common Era, and even today partially reconstructed after damage and earthquake, it is one of the most beautiful Roman monuments in existence. Leptis Magna, in the early 3rd century of the Common Era, was arguably the third largest city in Roman Africa after Carthage and Alexandria. Some estimates put its population at somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 people at its height. It had everything a Roman city was supposed to have built to a scale that announced clearly and loudly that this was not a provincial backwater. This was the hometown of an emperor, and it looked like it. Here is the part of this story that I find genuinely moving, and also, if I am being honest, a little bit melancholy. All of that investment, all of that marble, all of those columns, all of that imperial ambition made stone, was essentially a personal gift. Severus built Leptis Magna the way you might renovate your childhood home when you finally have the money to do it right. Because he could. Because he wanted the place that made him to reflect the person he had become. But here is the problem with building a city around one person's emotional investment. When that person is gone, the investment evaporates. Severus died in the year 211 of the Common Era in the city of Eboracum, the Roman name for what is now York in northern England, while on a military campaign in Britain. He was 65 years old, which was a genuinely impressive age for a Roman emperor, many of whom did not make it to 40. His last reported words to his sons were, according to the historian Cassius Dio, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men." Warm and fuzzy he was not. His sons, Caracalla and Geta, were not harmonious. Within a year, Caracalla had his brother murdered and became sole emperor. The careful administrative balance Severus had maintained began to fray almost immediately, and Leptis Magna, without its imperial patron, began the slow process of losing what made it special. The decline was not dramatic. That almost makes it worse. The harbour began to silt up. The Wadi Lebda, the river that ran alongside the city, carried sediment into the harbour basin faster than the Romans could dredge it. By the late 3rd century of the Common Era, the harbour that Severus had enlarged and engineered was becoming increasingly difficult to use for large vessels. Trade routes began shifting to other ports. The population started to shrink. Slowly at first, then more noticeably. The elaborate public buildings required maintenance, and maintenance required money, and money required a tax base, and the tax base was tied to trade, and trade was declining. The 3rd century was a brutal period for the entire Roman Empire, a time historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, running roughly from 235 to 284 of the Common Era, during which the empire cycled through more than 20 emperors, faced invasions on multiple frontiers simultaneously, and experienced an economic contraction that affected every city in the Roman world. Leptis Magna was not uniquely vulnerable. It was simply not uniquely protected anymore. By the 4th century of the Common Era, the city was still inhabited, but the grandeur was fading. Some of the great public buildings fell out of use. The colonnaded street that Severus had built with such care began to be encroached upon by smaller structures, vendors' workshops, the way a grand avenue gets slowly filled in when the money to maintain it is gone. There were raids by a Berber confederation called the Osturiani in the 360s of the Common Era that caused significant damage and disruption. The Byzantine general John the Elder attempted a partial restoration in the 6th century, but it was too little too late. By the 7th century, the Arab conquest transformed the political landscape of North Africa entirely, and Leptis Magna never fully recovered, never fully abandoned in that painful in-between state, finally emptied out for good. The sand moved in. The harbour disappeared under silt. The columns fell or were buried. The magnificent arch stood alone in what had become agricultural land used by local communities for centuries as a convenient source of pre-cut stone for other buildings. By the time European explorers rediscovered the ruins in the 18th and 19th centuries, they were stunned by what they found. The French consul Claude Lemaire visited in 1706 and reported back to the Académie des Inscriptions et Belles Lettres in Paris. British naval officers surveyed the ruins in the early 19th century and could not believe the scale of what the sand had preserved. Today, Leptis Magna is considered one of the finest examples of Roman architecture in the world. UNESCO listed it as a World Heritage Site in 1982. Archaeologists have been excavating it for over a century and are still finding new things. But here is the question I keep returning to, and I think it is worth sitting with. If Severus had been born somewhere else, if he had come from Rome or from Spain or from Gaul, would Leptis Magna have become what it became? Almost certainly not. The city's extraordinary transformation was inseparable from one man's personal attachment to it. His identity was built into those stones, and that is both the most beautiful thing about Leptis Magna and the most instructive, because it means the city's greatness was never really about the city. It was about a person, about longing and memory and the very human desire to leave something permanent in the place that first shaped you. Strip away Severus and you have a prosperous trading port. Add him back and you have a wonder of the ancient world. The lesson, if there is one, might be this: the most spectacular things are often the most fragile, precisely because they depend on something irreplaceable. A city built on trade can find new trade. A city built on one man's love for his hometown has to figure out how to survive when that love is gone. Leptis Magna never quite managed it. We have been moving across North Africa following cities that vanished for reasons of fire and sand and the quiet withdrawal of imperial attention. But the next story takes us somewhere entirely different north across the Mediterranean, to a city that most people alive today walk past every single day without realizing what it used to be. A city that did not lose its patron emperor. It lost something far more fundamental than that. It lost the entire civilization that had built it. And what happened next was so abrupt, so complete, that historians still struggle to fully account for it. The city is one you know by a different name than the Romans gave it, and the story of how it went from 60,000 people to almost nothing in the space of a single generation is, in my opinion, one of the most quietly devastating chapters in this entire journey. Let us go north. North then, across the Mediterranean, past the heel of Italy, up through Gaul, and across a cold grey channel of water the Romans called Mare Britannicum, to an island that, when the legions first arrived under Julius Caesar in 55 years before the Common Era, was considered so remote, so fog-wrapped, so genuinely at the edge of the known world that some Roman writers were not entirely sure it was real. Pytheas of Massalia had written about it 3 centuries earlier, and plenty of educated Romans back in the city treated his account the way we might treat a story about Bigfoot. Technically possible, probably exaggerated, best taken with a generous portion of salt. And yet Rome went there. Of course, Rome went there. Rome went everywhere. What they built on the northern bank of the River Thames, a settlement that would one day become one of the largest and most powerful cities on earth, they called Londinium. And what happened to it in the 5th century of the Common Era is, in my honest opinion, one of the most quietly shattering stories in this entire journey. Because Londinium did not end with a bang. It ended with a letter. Let me give you the city first, because it deserves to be understood at its height before we watch it fall. Londinium was not Rome's first choice for a capital in Britain. The initial Roman base of operations was at Camulodunum, modern Colchester, which had been the seat of a powerful British tribal king, and was therefore symbolically significant. But Londinium had something Camulodunum did not: geography. The Thames at that particular point was wide enough to be a serious commercial artery connecting Britain to the continent, but narrow enough to bridge. The surrounding land was defensible. The tidal reach of the river allowed ocean-going vessels to sail directly into the city. And the location sat roughly at the centre of the road network that the Romans were building across the island. By the end of the 1st century of the Common Era, Londinium had already eclipsed Camulodunum as the most important city in Roman Britain. It had a forum, one of the largest north of the Alps, covering an area roughly equivalent to about 3 modern city blocks. It had a basilica that served as the administrative and legal heart of the province, estimated to have been around 167 metres long, making it the largest building in Roman Britain by a considerable margin. It had temples, public baths, a theatre, a large amphitheatre discovered under what is now the Guildhall warehouses, stacked along the riverside, and a governor's palace that excavations have revealed to have been genuinely impressive by any standard. At its peak, somewhere around the late 2nd century of the Common Era, Londinium's population is estimated at somewhere between 45,000 and 60,000 people, which made it a major city, not Rome, not Alexandria, but comfortably in the tier of significant provincial capitals. A real city, a living, noisy, multilingual cosmopolitan city where you might hear Latin, Aramaic, Greek, various British Celtic dialects, and probably a few languages that have left no written record at all within the same market square. Now, the letter. To understand the letter, you need to understand the state of the Roman Empire in the early 5th century of the Common Era, and the honest summary is it was not good. The western half of the empire had been under sustained pressure for decades. Migrations and invasions across the Rhine and Danube frontiers, internal political instability, a military that was increasingly reliant on non-Roman troops, who had complicated loyalties, an economy that had been contracting for generations, all of it was adding up. The empire was not collapsing dramatically in a single moment. It was, to use a phrase I keep coming back to, running out of capacity. Britain had always been expensive to maintain. The island sat at the far northwestern edge of the empire required a permanent garrison of somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 soldiers at various points, and contributed less economically to the imperial treasury than provinces closer to the Mediterranean. When things got desperate elsewhere, Britain's troops got redeployed. In the year 407 of the Common Era, a general named Constantine, not the famous one, This was a different man who simply had the same name and the same ambitions, declared himself emperor in Britain, and led the remaining Roman troops across the Channel to press his claim in Gaul. He took most of the military with him. He did not come back. For the communities of Roman Britain, this created an immediate and practical crisis. Without the legions, there was no one to protect the towns and roads from the raiding parties, primarily Saxons from across the North Sea, and Pictish groups from the north that had been a persistent problem even when the army was present. The civic administration that depended on military backing began to struggle. The cities sent messages to Rome asking for help, and in the year 410 of the Common Era, the Emperor Honorius, who was at that particular moment dealing with the Visigoth leader Alaric threatening the city of Rome itself, so he had other things on his mind, sent back a response. The response in essence told the cities of Britain to look after their own defences. That is the letter. Or rather, that is the rescript, an official imperial response to a petition. Historians have debated for a long time exactly which cities it was addressed to and precisely what it meant legally. But the practical effect was clear enough. The central government of the greatest empire the Western world had ever known had just told its most remote province that it was administratively speaking on its own. There was no formal declaration that Rome was withdrawing from Britain. No ceremony, no official handover, no instructions for what came next. Just a letter saying, "Sort it out yourselves." Can you imagine receiving that you are a city councillor in Londinium, or a merchant or a craftsman who has spent your whole life inside a Roman city, with Roman laws and Roman infrastructure, and the letter arrives, and you realize slowly that no one is coming? What happened next is one of the most archaeologically striking episodes in British history. The population of Londinium dropped, sharply and relatively quickly. The exact timeline is difficult to establish because the archaeological record becomes sparse, which is itself part of the evidence. But by the mid-5th century of the Common Era, the city that had housed somewhere between 45,000 and 60,000 people at its height appears to have contracted dramatically. Some estimates suggest the population fell to as low as a few thousand. Others suggest even lower. The large public buildings stopped being maintained. The Forum, that enormous civic heart of the city, shows evidence of falling into disuse and partial demolition. The basilica was dismantled, its massive roof timbers were removed, probably for reuse elsewhere. The baths closed. The roads began to deteriorate without the organised labour needed to maintain them. People did not necessarily leave all at once. It was more that the systems that made a Roman city function, the organised tax collection, the trade networks, the legal administration, the military protection, collapsed layer by layer. And as each layer collapsed, the city became a little less viable, a little less worth staying in. The wealthy left first, probably. They had the resources to relocate connections elsewhere options. The merchants whose trade depended on connections to the continental Roman world found those connections drying up as the empire contracted. The craftsmen who supplied luxury goods to the wealthy found their customers gone. The workers who maintained the aqueducts and roads found no one paying them to do it. And here is the detail that stops me every time I think about it. Archaeologists working in London have found what they call a dark earth layer, a thick band of dark, silty soil that covers the Roman levels of the city in many locations dating to roughly the 5th through 7th centuries of the Common Era. This dark earth is not fully understood. It may represent the collapse of buildings and the decomposition of organic material over time. It may include evidence of gardens or animal grazing within the old city boundaries. It may contain a record of activities that left little permanent trace. But what it represents physically and visibly in the archaeological record is a gap a long, quiet gap where a city used to be. The Romans called it Londinium. The Anglo-Saxons, who eventually settled nearby deliberately outside the old Roman walls at first, in an area they called Lundenwic, may not have fully understood what the ruins inside those walls had once been. There is some evidence to suggest they found the empty Roman city faintly unsettling. Old English poetry refers to the ruins of Roman cities as the work of giants, enter Gewerk, as if the scale of what they saw was so far beyond their own building tradition that the only explanation was something superhuman. The giants had left, and they had left their city behind like a shed skin. London, of course, recovered. It recovered spectacularly over many centuries through the Anglo-Saxon period, through the Viking raids, through the Norman conquest, through the medieval expansion, through the Industrial Revolution, through everything, until it became one of the most important cities in the modern world. Today, roughly 9 million people live in Greater London. The city has not stopped growing in any meaningful sense for over 1,000 years. But underneath all of it, under the medieval streets, under the Victorian sewers, under the tube lines, under the glass towers of the financial district, the Roman city is still there. Not as dramatically as Pompeii, not as completely as Timgad, but present, in fragments, in the remnants of the city wall that still stand in places, in the mosaic floors occasionally uncovered by construction crews, in the traces of the Forum beneath the streets of the modern city centre. The Museum of London, now the London Museum relocated and rebuilt, holds an extraordinary collection of Roman Londinium artefacts: shoes, leather scraps, writing tablets, a bikini which caused quite a stir when it was found because apparently the Romans were considerably more relaxed about beachwear than later centuries would be. Personal items, mundane items, the accumulated physical evidence of a city that was very much alive before it went quiet. Here is what I want to leave you with from Londinium as we prepare to move on. Every major city in the world has a story of near disappearance somewhere in its past. London's is perhaps more complete than most, a city that genuinely contracted to something close to nothing before rebuilding itself from the ground up over centuries. The continuity we assume between Roman Londinium and modern London is archaeologically speaking much thinner than most people realise. The city did not simply evolve, it stopped, and then slowly, imperfectly, on different terms in a different language, it started again, which makes you wonder about the relationship between a place and the civilization that inhabits it. Is a city, its buildings, its population, its laws and language and systems? Or is it something more stubborn than all of that? Something in the geography, in the particular bend of the river, in the reason the Romans chose that spot in the first place, that keeps pulling people back generation after generation, even when everything else has changed? I do not have a clean answer to that. But the question feels important. And that question gets even stranger with the next city on our journey, because what we just watched with Londinium, a Roman city losing its connection to the empire and going quiet, happened everywhere in the West when Rome fell. It happened in France, in Spain, in Germany and North Africa. But there was one city sitting on the edge of the Atlantic in what is now Morocco, where something different happened entirely. Something that, when you first hear it, sounds almost too strange to be true. When Rome fell and the empire collapsed and the lights went out across the western provinces, this city did not go quiet. It kept going. It kept speaking Latin. It kept using Roman law. It kept calling itself Roman. For 200 years. Alone. Without Rome. And nobody, it seems, had the heart to tell them it was over. 200 years. Alone, without Rome. Before we go any further, I just want to sit with that for a second, because I think it is the kind of statement that sounds dramatic until you actually think about what it means. Imagine your entire world, your language, your laws, your identity, your sense of what civilization even is has been handed to you by an institution that no longer exists. The government that built your roads has dissolved. The army that protected your borders has been reassigned, reorganized, or simply stopped existing. The emperor whose face appears on your coins is either dead or ruling from a city so distant and so diminished that the connection feels theoretical at best. And you just keep going. You keep holding council meetings. You keep maintaining the public records. You keep speaking the language, observing the festivals, carving the inscriptions. Because what else do you do? Because this is who you are. Because Rome is not just a place on a map, it is a way of understanding yourself, and you are not ready to stop understanding yourself that way. That is not a metaphor. That is the actual documented history of a small city in the foothills of the Atlas Mountains in what is now northern Morocco. The city is called Volubilis, and its story is unlike anything else in the Roman world. Let me give you the geography and the context, because both matter enormously here. Volubilis sits in the Gharb plain of northern Morocco, about 30 kilometers north of the modern city of Meknes, at the foot of the Zerhoun Massif. The elevation is around 400 meters. The soil is extraordinarily fertile. The Romans grew enormous quantities of wheat and olives here, and the location puts it at the far southwestern edge of what the Romans called Mauritania Tingitana, the northernmost province of their African territories. It was in Roman terms genuinely remote. Not Sahara remote like Timgad, but frontier remote. The kind of place where the empire thinned out at the edges, where the administrative connection to Rome was always a little looser, the response times a little longer, the sense of being on your own a little more familiar. The city's origins predate Rome entirely. There was a Berber settlement here, and then a Phoenician-influenced town before Roman annexation formalized the province of Mauritania Tingitana in the year 40 of the Common Era under the Emperor Claudius. The Romans then built up Volubilis systematically, a forum, a basilica, a capital temple, public baths, a triumphal arch erected in 217 of the Common Era, to honour the Emperor Caracalla, colonnaded streets, private townhouses with beautiful mosaic floors that are still visible today. At its peak, Volubilis had a population of somewhere between 12,000 and 20,000 people. It was a genuinely mixed community, Roman administrators and soldiers, Berber families who had adopted Roman civic culture over generations, traders from across the Mediterranean, freedmen, craftspeople. The inscriptions found at the site are in Latin, Greek, Punic and Neo-Punic, which gives you a sense of just how layered the city's cultural identity actually was. It was prosperous, organized and thoroughly Roman in its public life, even if the people living in it came from backgrounds that predated Rome by centuries. Now, the year is 285 of the Common Era. The Emperor Diocletian is in the process of making a series of administrative decisions that will reshape the empire. One of those decisions involves Mauritania Tingitana. The province is expensive to maintain, geographically isolated from the rest of Roman North Africa, separated by the Rif Mountains, and then a long stretch of territory that was never fully under Roman control, and strategically less critical than other frontiers demanding urgent attention. Diocletian decides to withdraw the Roman military and administrative presence from Mauritania Tingitana, not because the province has been conquered or destroyed, but simply because the empire no longer has the capacity to maintain everything simultaneously, and something has to give. The legions pack up, the administrators leave, the official connection to the imperial system is severed, and Volubilis is left standing there blinking in the Atlantic light. Here is what makes this story genuinely extraordinary, and what separates it from everything else we've looked at tonight. It did not collapse. Most Roman cities, when the Roman administrative and military framework was removed, declined fairly quickly. The infrastructure deteriorated, trade networks, contracted population dropped the cycle of withdrawal that we've seen play out in city after city across the empire. Volubilis did not follow that pattern. Not immediately and not completely. The Berber and Roman Berber community that remained in the city after the official Roman withdrawal continued to govern itself. They continued using Latin as the language of administration and public life. They continued observing Roman legal customs. They continued maintaining to the best of their ability the civic structures the Romans had built. We know this because of the inscriptions. Epigraphic evidence inscriptions carved in stone from the post-withdrawal period at Volubilis, continues to use standard Roman administrative Latin, continues to reference Roman civic offices and titles, continues to frame local identity in Roman terms. One inscription, dating to around 280 of the Common Era, records a local notable in terms that would have been entirely legible to any Roman bureaucrat anywhere in the empire. The city was performing Romanness genuinely, not as imitation, long after the empire that had invented that performance had moved on. There is a specific term historians sometimes use for this kind of cultural persistence, sub-Roman. It describes the societies and communities that maintained Roman cultural practices after the formal Roman administrative presence had ended. Britain, Gaul, and Spain all had sub-Roman periods of varying length and character. But Volubilis is perhaps the most remarkable example of all, precisely because of its geographical isolation. Britain's sub-Roman period happened in a place where other Roman cities were also going through similar experiences, where the memory and material culture of Rome was everywhere. Volubilis was out on its own. There was no neighbouring province to compare notes with, no nearby city going through the same thing. Just this one community in the foothills of the Atlas Mountains deciding apparently through collective will, rather than any external instruction to remain Roman. For approximately 200 years after the official withdrawal, Volubilis continued to function as a Roman-style city. The population may have actually grown in the immediate post-withdrawal period as people from the surrounding countryside moved into the relative safety of the walled city. Local Berber leaders adopted Latin names and Roman civic titles. The forum continued to be used. The public buildings continued to be maintained or at least not actively demolished. Let me ask you something genuinely. If the government that defined your entire identity, your language, your laws, your sense of civic belonging suddenly ceased to exist, what would you do? Would you build something new from scratch? Or would you keep the old forms going because they were the only forms you knew, because they still worked well enough? Because the alternative of starting over was too frightening or too abstract to contemplate? I think Volubilis answers that question in one of the most human ways imaginable. They kept going. Not out of denial necessarily, but out of a kind of practical stubborn continuity that I find deeply admirable. The city's final chapter came in the 7th century of the Common Era, when the Arab conquest transformed North Africa. The Umayyad forces reached the region of modern Morocco in the 680s and 690s of the Common Era, and the political and cultural landscape of the entire region changed irrevocably. Volubilis did not end violently. The archaeological evidence does not suggest a dramatic sack or sudden destruction. It suggests rather a gradual transition, a shift in population patterns, a change in the cultural framework, a slow movement away from the old Roman urban model toward different ways of organizing community life. The nearby city of Walili, an Arabic adaptation of the old name Volubilis, became Moulay Idris Zahun, a significant Islamic holy city when Idris I established his base there in the 780s of the Common Era, and founded the Idrisid dynasty, the first Arab dynasty in Morocco. The old Roman city, sitting just a few kilometres away, became a source of building materials, its stones quarried for new construction. In the growing Islamic city, its columns repurposed, its marble recut. By the medieval period, Volubilis as a functioning settlement had essentially ceased to exist. What remained were ruins that local communities lived alongside, harvested for stone, and passed stories about. The Great Earthquake of 1755, the same earthquake that devastated Lisbon and sent shockwaves across the Atlantic, caused significant additional damage to the standing structures. The triumphal arch that had welcomed visitors since the 3rd century of the Common Era fell, though it has since been partially re-erected. European travellers visiting in the 18th and 19th centuries found the ruins immediately striking. The French began systematic excavations in the early 20th century during the period of the French Protectorate, and the results were extraordinary, spectacular mosaic floors, the remains of the Forum and Basilica, the triumphal arch private houses with intact decorative programs. UNESCO World Heritage listing came in 1997. Today, Volubilis receives visitors from around the world who walk its ancient streets and look out over the same fertile plain that Roman and Berber farmers cultivated for centuries. What I keep returning to with Volubilis is the question of identity and its relationship to place and institution. The people of Volubilis did not become Roman because they were conquered and forced to adopt a foreign culture. Over generations, they had genuinely internalized a Roman civic identity. It had become their identity, layered over and intertwined with their older Berber roots. And when the institution that had given them that identity withdrew, they did not immediately shed it. They carried it forward on their own authority because it was genuinely theirs. That is a profoundly human response to institutional collapse. We cling to the forms and frameworks that have defined us, even when the institution behind them is gone, because the forms themselves have become part of who we are. They are not just habits, they are identity. There is something quietly moving about, a community of people in the Atlas foothills, maintaining Latin inscriptions and Roman civic offices 2 centuries after the last Roman administrator sailed away. It is not sad exactly. It is more like watching someone hold a candle in a large dark room long after the electricity has gone out. Not because the candle is as good as the lights, but because the candle is what they have, and the light still means something. So we have fires and sand and letters of abandonment and 2-century acts of cultural stubbornness. Each of these cities stopped in a different way for different reasons on a different timeline. But here is something I have been holding back, and I think it is time to talk about it. Because in all of these individual stories, Pompeii Herculaneum Timgad Leptis, Magna Londinium Volubilis, there is a pattern underneath. Something systemic. Something that was happening to all of them simultaneously long before the volcanoes and the letters and the shifting trade routes. It was happening in the money, in the markets, in the slow grinding economic reality that was quietly hollowing out the Roman world from the inside decades before any barbarian crossed any border, before any emperor wrote any letter, before any harbour silted up. And to understand it, we need to step back from the individual cities for a moment and look at the whole picture. Because the next chapter of this story is not about one city. It is about what happens to all cities when the economic foundation they were built on starts to crack. It is a story about money and inflation and taxes and what happens when a civilization slowly runs out of the means to sustain itself. It is, in other words, a story that might feel uncomfortably familiar. All right, set aside the volcanoes for a moment. Set aside the desert sand, the imperial letters, the barbarian raids. Because the most dangerous thing that ever happened to Roman cities was not dramatic. It did not arrive with fire or the sound of hooves. It arrived quietly the way the worst problems always do. It arrived in the marketplace, in the gap between what a loaf of bread cost last year and what it costs today, in the face of a tax collector showing up at the door of a farmer who has already sold everything he owns and still cannot pay what is owed, in the slow grinding realization spreading city by city across the empire that the system underpinning everything, the invisible architecture of money, trade and trust that Roman civilization had been built on, was starting to come apart at the seams. This is the story of the crisis of the 3rd century, and if you have never heard of it, I want to make a case tonight that it is one of the most important and most underappreciated chapters in the history of Western civilization. Because without understanding what happened to the Roman economy between roughly 235 and 284 of the Common Era, the individual city collapses we've been exploring all evening make only partial sense. The economic catastrophe of the 3rd century was the ground beneath all of them. It was the thing that made every subsequent disaster harder to survive. Let me start with a number, because this particular number has genuinely never left me since I first encountered it. In the early years of the Roman Empire, let us say around the 1st century of the Common Era, the silver content of the standard Roman coin, the denarius, was approximately 90% pure silver. That coin was the backbone of the Roman economy. Soldiers were paid in it. Taxes were collected in it. Trade across the empire's 5 million square kilometers was conducted using it as a common medium of exchange. Its stability was fundamental to everything. By the year 265 of the Common Era, this silver content of the denarius had fallen to approximately 2 to 5%. 2 to 5%. From 90% to essentially silver-plated bronze in roughly 2.5 centuries. That is not a monetary policy decision. That is desperation made metal. Successive emperors facing military crises on multiple frontiers simultaneously needing to pay armies that would otherwise simply stop fighting, or worse, start fighting for someone else, had been systematically debasing the currency. Melting down coins, mixing in cheaper metals, reminting them at the same face value, and using the difference to fund the next campaign. And then doing it again, and again, and again. The Roman economy, which was sophisticated enough to understand exactly what was happening, responded the way economies always respond to currency debasement. Prices went up. Rapidly and then catastrophically. Historians studying Egyptian papyrus records, which give us unusually detailed price data from this period, have documented that the price of wheat in Egypt increased by roughly 15 times between the years 200 and 275 of the Common Era. Not 15%, 15 times. What cost 1 unit of currency at the beginning of that period cost 15 at the end. If you had a fixed income, a fixed salary, a fixed pension, as most Roman soldiers and civil servants did, this was devastating. Your purchasing power evaporated. The money in your hand bought less and less with every passing season. Now here is where it connects directly to the cities. Roman cities were not self-sufficient. They depended on trade. A city like Aventicum, the capital of the Roman province of Germania Superior, located in what is now Avenches in modern Switzerland, was a thriving provincial capital of perhaps 20,000 people in the 2nd century of the Common Era. It had a theatre, an amphitheatre, temples, public baths, city walls, stretching over more than 5 kilometres in circumference, a sophisticated water system. Inscriptions from the period describe it as the mother of the Helvetii, the civic heart of the region. It had all of this because it sat at the intersection of trade routes connecting the Rhine frontier to Italy. Merchants moved through it constantly. Money circulated. The local economy was plugged into the wider imperial system. When the currency collapsed and inflation exploded, that circulation seized up. Merchants who could not predict what their goods would be worth by the time they reached the next city began pulling back from long-distance trade. The complex supply chains that fed Roman cities, grain from North Africa, wine from Gaul, olive oil from Spain, luxury goods from the eastern provinces became more expensive, less reliable, and in some cases simply stopped functioning. And simultaneously the tax burden increased, because the emperors needed money for armies and the armies needed more money because soldiers demanded raises to compensate for the collapsing value of their pay, and the only way to fund those raises was to tax the provinces harder. The people who paid Roman taxes were not primarily the wealthy. The wealthy had political connections and ways of shifting their burden. The people who paid Roman taxes were the farmers, the craftspeople, the small traders, the backbone of the provincial economy. And when the tax demands became impossible to meet, those people made the most rational decision available to them. They left. The phenomenon historians call tax flight or rural abandonment is one of the most striking features of the late Roman archaeological record across the western provinces. Farmsteads that show continuous occupation from the 1st and 2nd centuries suddenly show no occupation from the 3rd century onward. Villages contract. Agricultural land that had been intensively farmed for generations reverts to scrub. The people did not disappear. They moved to places where the tax collectors were less persistent, or where they could operate outside the formal economy, or where powerful local landowners offered them protection in exchange for labour on terms that resembled increasingly serfdom. This is the direct economic root of medieval feudalism, by the way. The collapse of the small independent farmer under the weight of Roman taxation pushed people into dependency on large landowners, and that dependency became the structural template for the social organisation of post-Roman Europe. The Middle Ages, in a very real sense, were partly born in the tax crisis of the 3rd century. But for the cities, the effect was more immediate and more visible. Cities depended on the agricultural surplus of their surrounding regions. When that surplus declined because the farmers had left or reduced their output, the cities felt it directly. Food became more expensive. The urban poor went hungry. The middle classes, the merchants and craftspeople who had given Roman cities their distinctive commercial energy contracted. The public buildings that had defined Roman urban life required constant maintenance. Baths needed fuel and staff. Aqueducts needed regular repair. Forums needed cleaning and management. All of this required civic funds, and civic funds came from taxes and trade. When both contracted, the maintenance stopped, and when maintenance stopped, the building started to deteriorate. Let me bring this back to Aventicum because it makes the abstract concrete in a way I find genuinely affecting. By the middle of the 3rd century of the Common Era, the city that had called itself the Mother of the Helvetii was in visible trouble. The Germanic Alemanni tribe crossed the Roman frontier and raided deep into the province in the 259 and 260 of the Common Era. The city suffered damage, possibly significant damage, during this period. The combination of external raid and internal economic contraction proved too much. The population began to fall. The city did not vanish overnight. There is evidence of continued occupation well into the late Roman and early medieval periods, but the scale of urban life shrank dramatically. The theatre fell into disuse. The amphitheatre was partially dismantled and its stones reused. The elaborate public infrastructure that had marked Aventicum as a proper Roman city deteriorated without the funds or the organised civic will to maintain it. By the early medieval period, Aventicum had contracted to a small settlement. The modern town of Avenci, which sits on the same site today, has a population of around 3,000 people. The Roman walls that once enclosed a city of 20,000 are still partly visible standing in the fields outside the modern town, like the frame of a house with no walls marking the ghost of an ambition that once seemed entirely reasonable. I visited Avenches in my mind many times before I understood what it was teaching me. It is teaching me that the line between thriving Roman city and small Swiss town with some nice ruins is not a line drawn by catastrophe. It is a line drawn by compound interest, by the slow accumulation of smaller problems, each one manageable in isolation, all of them together becoming something that no single decision or policy could reverse. Here is the analytical point I want to make clearly because I think it matters beyond just Roman history. The economic collapse of the 3rd century was not caused by any single bad decision. It was the result of a structural problem in how Roman civilization was organized financially. The empire's economy was at its core a conquest economy. It expanded, it extracted wealth from conquered territories, and it used that wealth to fund the army that enabled further expansion. The legions were paid with the spoils of conquest. The building programs were funded by the same. When expansion stopped, as it effectively did after the reign of Trajan in the early 2nd century of the Common Era, the input of new wealth from conquest stopped with it. But the cost did not stop. The army still needed to be paid. The infrastructure still needed to be maintained. The bureaucracy still needed to function. And the empire now had to fund all of that not from the profits of expansion, but from the taxation of its own population. That is a fundamentally different and fundamentally harder problem, and Rome over the long run never fully solved it. The currency debasement was not the cause of the crisis. It was the symptom, the visible evidence of an empire that was spending more than it could sustainably extract, reaching into its own monetary system, like a family raiding its savings account to pay the monthly bills, hoping that something would change before the account ran empty. Something did eventually change. Diocletian in the 280s and 290s of the Common Era implemented a series of reforms, a new tax system, a new currency, a new administrative structure, dividing the empire into smaller units that stabilized things for a while. But the cities that had contracted during the crisis did not simply bounce back when the crisis ended. A city that loses half its population does not automatically regain it when economic conditions improve. The craftspeople who left do not automatically return. The trade networks that collapse do not automatically reconnect. The institutional memory of how to maintain the aqueduct is gone if the people who knew how to do it have moved away or died. Economic damage to cities compounds over time even after the immediate cause is removed. That is true in the 3rd century of the Common Era. And if we are honest with ourselves, it is just as true today. There is a city in modern Pennsylvania called Youngstown. In the 1960s, it had a population of 170,000 people and was one of the most productive steel-producing cities in the United States. Today, its population is somewhere around 60,000. The old steel plants are gone. Large sections of the city have been formally demolished because there are not enough people to occupy them. It is a modern example of the same basic phenomenon. The economic foundation shifts. The population contracts the infrastructure that assumed a certain scale, becomes impossible to maintain. I'm not saying Youngstown is Rome. I am saying the mechanism is recognizable across 2,000 years. Cities are not eternal. They're expressions of economic and political conditions. And when those conditions change fundamentally enough, the city changes with them, sometimes beyond recovery. But here is the thing about the 3rd century crisis that I have been building toward, and that sets up the next part of our journey perfectly. The economic collapse did not happen in isolation. Running alongside it, intertwined with it, amplifying its effects in ways that were almost impossible to separate, was something even more devastating to Roman urban populations, something you could not tax your way out of, something you could not reform or legislate or militarily defeat, something that arrived invisibly, moved through cities faster than any army, and reduced populations not over decades but over months. Disease. Epidemic, catastrophic, civilization-altering disease. And the two great plagues that struck the Roman Empire in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era did not just kill people. They killed the confidence that Roman cities had in their own future. They killed the assumption of continuity that had underpinned everything, and that in many ways was the more lasting damage. There is a particular kind of fear that money problems cannot produce on their own. When the currency collapses, people are frightened, certainly. When the taxes become impossible, people are angry, desperate, exhausted. But there is still underneath all of that economic anxiety a fundamental assumption that tomorrow exists, that you will wake up, that the people you love will still be there, that whatever is broken can in theory be fixed if someone smart enough gets to work on it. Plague removes that assumption entirely, and the Roman Empire, already weakened by the economic pressures we just walked through, was hit by not one but two catastrophic epidemic events in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era. Two waves of mass death separated by roughly 80 years, each one tearing through the densely populated, intensely connected cities of the Roman world, with a ferocity that no military campaign could match. I want to talk about both of them. Not in a clinical way, the numbers are staggering enough to speak for themselves, but in terms of what they actually did to the fabric of Roman urban life. Because the damage was not just demographic, it was psychological, it was structural, and it was in ways that I find genuinely haunting when I sit with them long enough, remarkably familiar. The first epidemic is known as the Antonine Plague, named for the Antonine dynasty of emperors under whose reign it struck. It arrived in the Roman world in approximately 165 of the Common Era, carried back by soldiers returning from a military campaign in the eastern provinces, specifically from the region around Seleucia on the Tigris River in what is now Iraq. Whatever the disease actually was, and historians and medical researchers have debated this for decades, with smallpox and measles being the most frequently proposed candidates, it spread with terrifying efficiency through a population that had no prior exposure and therefore no immunity. The Roman Empire of the mid-2nd century was in many respects the ideal environment for a pandemic. The road network that connected every corner of the empire, those famous 400,000 kilometers of paved roads we mentioned earlier, was not just a conduit for trade and armies, it was a conduit for disease. Every merchant, every soldier, every pilgrim, every courier who travelled those roads was a potential carrier. The cities they passed through were densely populated with public baths, markets, and entertainment venues that brought thousands of people into close daily contact. Galen, the most important physician of the ancient world, whose medical writings would remain authoritative in Europe for over 1,000 years, was practicing medicine in Rome when the epidemic arrived. His descriptions of the symptoms are among our most valuable primary sources: fever, diarrhea, vomiting, throat inflammation, skin eruptions that appeared around the 9th day of illness. He documented cases, carefully tried various treatments, and watched the city around him transform. At its peak in Rome, the Antonine Plague was reportedly killing 2,000 people per day. Per day, in a city whose total population at the time was somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million people, that is an almost incomprehensible death rate. Contemporary sources describe bodies being carted through the streets, funerals overlapping the ordinary rhythms of urban life, suspended under the weight of grief and fear. The epidemic lasted with varying intensity for approximately 15 years. It recurred a second wave hit around 169 of the Common Era and never fully disappeared from certain regions of the empire for decades afterward. The total death toll is genuinely difficult to establish. Ancient sources vary wildly, and modern historians approach the numbers with caution. The most conservative scholarly estimates suggest somewhere between 5 and 10 million deaths across the empire over the course of the epidemic. Some historians argue for figures considerably higher. The exact number, however, matters less than the structural impact. Because here is what 5 to 10 million deaths in a pre-industrial society actually means in practice. It means that the agricultural workforce, the people who grew the food that fed the cities, was dramatically reduced. Fields that required a certain number of labourers to plant, tend and harvest could no longer be maintained at the same level. Output fell. Food prices, already under pressure from the currency problems we discussed, climbed further. It means that the artisans, craftspeople and traders who sustained urban commercial life were thinned out. Workshops closed not because of economic conditions, but simply because the people who ran them were dead. Skills that had been passed from master to apprentice over generations were interrupted. Some were lost entirely. It means that the military, already stretched across thousands of kilometers of frontier, lost trained soldiers faster than it could replace them. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who ruled during the height of the Antonine Plague, and whose personal philosophical writings in his work known as the Meditations reflect a man trying to find equanimity in the face of enormous pressure, was forced to make increasingly desperate decisions about military manpower. He enrolled slaves into the legions. He recruited Germanic warriors from across the frontier. He did whatever it took to keep the armies at fighting strength. And this is the detail that most directly connects to our story of cities. He settled large groups of barbarian peoples within the empire's borders to repopulate agricultural land that had been emptied by the plague. Think about the long-term implications of that decision. The cultural homogeneity that had made the Roman provincial world function, the shared language law and civic culture that held everything together, began to dilute at precisely the moment when the economic and military stresses were already multiplying. It was not a bad decision given the circumstances. It was probably the best available option. But it set in motion a transformation of the empire's demographic character that would accelerate dramatically over the following 2 centuries. Now, 80 years pass. The empire stabilizes more or less. Diocletian's reforms bring a degree of order. Constantine I moves the capital to Constantinople. Christianity becomes the official religion of the empire. Things change, but the Roman world keeps functioning. And then in 249 of the Common Era, the Second Great Plague arrives. It is called the Plague of Cyprian, named for Thasius Caecilius Cyprianus, the Bishop of Carthage, who wrote about it extensively and somewhat dramatically, describing symptoms that included eyes on fire, vomiting, swollen throats, gangrenous hands and feet, and an overall sense that the world was ending. Cyprian himself survived. Many of the people he wrote about did not. The identity of this disease is even more contested than that of the Antonine Plague. Some researchers have proposed hemorrhagic fever. Others have suggested a filovirus related to modern Ebola. The symptoms Cyprian describes and symptoms described in other contemporary sources include some features that do not fit neatly into any disease we currently recognize, which raises the uncomfortable possibility that it may have been something that no longer exists in its original form. What we know is this. At its peak, the Plague of Cyprian was reportedly killing 5,000 people per day in the city of Rome alone. The epidemic lasted for approximately 20 years, from 249 to 262 of the Common Era, with peak mortality in the early 250s. And it struck during what was already the worst period of political and military crisis the Empire had ever faced, the crisis of the 3rd century that we walked through in the previous chapter. The combination of epidemic, disease, currency collapse, military pressure on multiple frontiers, and political instability cycling through emperor after emperor created a perfect compound catastrophe that the Roman world had simply never experienced before. Here is where I want to zoom in on a specific city, because the archaeology tells a story that statistics alone cannot. The city of Luxor in modern Egypt, ancient Thebes, home to some of the most spectacular monuments in the world, contains within its massive temple complex an area that was in the Roman period a military barracks. And in that area, archaeologists in 2019 discovered a remarkable and disturbing find: a mass burial site containing bodies that had been covered in lime, a standard ancient disinfection practice, and what appeared to be the remains of a kiln used to produce that lime. Nearby there were furnaces and more lime-covered bodies. The excavation team, led by the Italian archaeological mission to Luxor, concluded that what they had found was a plague disposal site, a place where bodies had been hastily buried and treated with lime during what they assessed based on dating evidence to be consistent with the period of the plague of Cyprian. The scale of the disposal operation, the use of lime, the apparent haste, all of it points to a community overwhelmed by death, doing what it could to manage the biological reality of mass mortality, while simultaneously trying to prevent further spread. This was not a remote provincial backwater. This was a city with a Roman military presence in one of the most agriculturally and administratively important provinces of the empire, and they were burning lime and burying bodies in their own temple complex because the death toll had exceeded their capacity to respond in any more organized way. Now let me make the connection to COVID-19 that I promised at the beginning of this journey, because I think it is genuinely instructive, and I want to be careful here to be accurate rather than alarmist. The Roman plagues and the COVID-19 pandemic are very different events in terms of mortality rates, medical understanding, and available responses. I am not suggesting they are equivalent in scale or character, but the mechanism by which epidemic disease damages urban economies is remarkably consistent across time. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit in 2020, cities around the world watched their commercial cores empty almost overnight. Restaurants, theatres, shops, transit systems, all of the infrastructure of dense urban life went quiet. Supply chains disrupted. The people who ran small businesses in those cities did not all come back when the restrictions lifted. Some had retrained, relocated, or simply closed permanently. Some neighbourhoods that had been commercially vibrant before 2020 had not fully recovered years later. Now imagine that process without modern medicine, without government financial support programs, without the ability to rapidly develop treatments or understand transmission patterns, and without the knowledge that it would eventually end. Imagine it lasting not a year or two, but a decade or two, recurring in waves, with no clear endpoint visible. That is what the Antonina Plague and the Plague of Cyprian did to Roman cities. They did not simply reduce the population, they disrupted the confidence and continuity that urban commercial life depends on. They broke the chains of transmission, not just biological transmission, but the transmission of skills, of business relationships, of civic knowledge, of the accumulated social capital that makes a city function. A city is not just buildings and roads. It is the web of human relationships and habits and knowledge that fills those buildings and travels those roads. When that web is torn severely enough, quickly enough, the buildings and roads are not sufficient to hold the city together on their own. The Bishop Cyprian, writing in the midst of the epidemic that bears his name, said something that I have thought about many times in different contexts. He wrote, and I am paraphrasing here, that the plague was revealing which people had genuine faith, and which had only the appearance of it because true faith did not fear death. I am not making a theological point, but I find the observation interesting for a different reason. What Cyprian was noticing was that the epidemic was a revelatory event. It stripped away the surface and showed what was underneath. It showed which cities had strong enough civic bonds to maintain collective action in a crisis, and which did not. It showed which communities could sustain cooperation under pressure, and which fragmented. It showed in the starkest possible terms the difference between resilience and fragility in human social organization. The Roman cities that survived the plague years, that maintained their populations, their trade, their civic institutions, were not necessarily the biggest or the richest. They were often the ones with the deepest roots of local identity, the strongest informal networks of mutual support, the most flexible capacity to adapt to radically changed circumstances. And that observation, I think, is not merely historical. We have now looked at fire and sand and letters of abandonment and economic collapse and epidemic disease, each one a different thread in the same unravelling, each one making the next problem harder to survive. But there is still one more common misconception about the fall of Roman cities that I have been deliberately holding back, because I think it deserves its own space. Because most people, if you ask them right now why Roman cities fell, will say the same thing. They will say the barbarians, the Goths, the Vandals, the Huns, the armies pouring across the frontier, the sack of Rome, the dramatic end of civilization at the point of a sword, and they are not entirely wrong. But they are not nearly as right as they think they are, because the story of who actually destroyed Roman cities and who did not is considerably more complicated, considerably more interesting, and considerably more surprising than the simple image of civilization swept away by outsiders at the gate. That is where we are heading next. And I promise you the answer will change how you think about collapse. Not just Roman collapse, but every civilization that has ever come apart at the edges. The barbarians are waiting. Let us go meet them, and let us find out how much of the blame they actually deserve. Good. Let us talk about the barbarians, because honestly they deserve a fairer hearing than history has given them, and the truth about what they actually did and did not do to Roman cities is one of the most genuinely surprising reversals in all of ancient history. It is the kind of thing that makes you realize how much of what we think we know about the past is really just a story someone told us, and we accepted it because it was dramatic and simple and fit neatly into a picture we already had in our heads. The standard picture goes something like this. Rome was great. Then the barbarians came, wild, uncivilized, violent men from beyond the frontier, speaking incomprehensible languages, wearing animal skins with no appreciation for art or lore or the finer things in life. They poured across the borders, smashed everything in sight, and the lights went out on Western civilization for 1,000 years. That is the story. It is the story that Edward Gibbon essentially told in his monumental work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in the 18th Century, and it lodged itself so deeply in the Western historical imagination that it is still the first explanation most people reach for. It is also in important and specific ways wrong, or at least dramatically incomplete. Let me show you what I mean. Start with the most famous event in the entire narrative, the sack of Rome. In August of the year 410 of the Common Era, a Visigoth army led by a man named Alaric entered the city of Rome and spent 3 days looting it. This event sent shockwaves through the Roman world that can barely be overstated. St. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem when he heard the news, described it as the moment the light of the world was extinguished. St. Augustine began writing his enormous theological work, The City of God, partly in response to the shock and the philosophical crisis it provoked. The sack of Rome in 410 was without question a significant and traumatic event in the history of the Western Roman Empire. Now, what did Alaric and the Visigoths actually destroy? The honest answer is surprisingly little. The looting lasted 3 days. Contemporary accounts describe the Visigoths taking gold, silver, and portable valuables. They did not burn the city systematically. They did not demolish the major public buildings. The Colosseum was still standing when they left. The Forum was still standing. The great basilicas were still standing. The aqueduct, the road network, the administrative infrastructure largely intact. Alaric himself, interestingly, was a Christian. The Visigoths were Arian Christians, a different theological tradition from the mainstream Roman Church, but Christian nonetheless. Alaric had served in the Roman army. He had held Roman military titles. He had for years before the sack been trying to negotiate a formal settlement with the Roman government seeking land for his people to settle and an official military commission. The Roman government under the ineffectual Emperor Honorius, safely ensconced in Ravenna, kept stonewalling him. The sack of Rome in 410 was not in any straightforward sense the act of an outsider attacking civilization. It was the act of a man who had spent his career inside the Roman system, had been repeatedly failed by that system, and had finally run out of patience. It was closer to a very violent industrial dispute than to the clash of civilization and barbarism that later centuries chose to see in it. And 3 days after the sack began, Alaric led his army out of Rome and headed south. The city he had looted continued to exist. Its population continued to live there. Its institutions continued to function, damaged and traumatized, but not destroyed. Let me give you a second example, because one case can always be explained away. The Vandals and I want to note here that the modern English word vandalism comes from their name, which tells you something about how history has treated them. Sacked Rome again in 455 of the Common Era under their king Gaiseric. This event has gone down in history as a byword for mindless destruction. The Vandal sack of Rome lasted 14 days. It was more thorough than Alaric's raid in terms of the quantity of valuables removed. Gaiseric systematically stripped the city of portable wealth, including famously the treasures that the Emperor Titus had brought back from the temple in Jerusalem after its destruction in the year 70 of the Common Era. But here too the physical fabric of the city survived. The major buildings were not demolished. The population was not massacred. A Byzantine writer named Procopius, writing about a century later, specifically notes that Gaiseric prohibited his men from setting fires or committing acts of wanton destruction. The Vandals were looters organized and efficient. They were not destroyers in the sense of people who wanted to erase what Rome had built. Are you starting to see the pattern? Now let me flip the question entirely, because the most important question is not what the various peoples crossing the Roman frontier did to Roman cities. The most important question is what state were those cities already in when the so-called barbarians arrived? And here is where the archaeological and historical evidence becomes genuinely damning, not of the Goths or the Vandals, but of the Roman system itself. Study after study of Roman cities in the western provinces in Britain, in Gaul, in Spain, in North Africa has found the same pattern. Urban populations begin declining in the late 3rd century of the Common Era. Public buildings show evidence of reduced maintenance, informal modification, and gradual abandonment from the same period. Commercial activity contracts. The material culture shifts from the high-quality mass-produced goods that characterized Roman consumer culture to lower-quality locally produced items, not because people's tastes changed, but because the trade networks that supplied the better goods had weakened or collapsed. All of this happens before the major barbarian settlements and kingdoms establish themselves in the western provinces. In many cases, it happens generations before. What this means in plain terms is that the Western Roman cities were already in serious structural decline when the post-Roman successor kingdoms emerged. The Visigoths in Spain and southern Gaul, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Franks in northern Gaul, the Vandals in North Africa, they did not arrive to destroy thriving urban civilizations. In many cases, they arrived to manage the remains of urban civilizations that had been contracting for a long time. There is a historian named Brian Ward Perkins whose book on the fall of Rome makes a careful and important argument that I want to engage with honestly here because the picture is not entirely rosy for the post-Roman period. Ward Perkins points out correctly that the archaeological evidence does show a real and significant decline in material living standards across much of the Western Roman world in the 5th and 6th centuries of the Common Era. Pottery quality drops, building complexity decreases, literacy rates appear to fall. The sheer volume and variety of material goods that ordinary people had access to diminishes noticeably. This is real. It happened. The post-Roman world was in material terms simpler and in many respects harder than the High Roman Empire had been for many ordinary people. But and this is the crucial distinction, the question is whether that decline was caused by the barbarian migrations and settlements, or whether it was already well advanced when those migrations occurred, and the migrants simply inherited and were shaped by a world that was already contracting. The weight of evidence across multiple lines of historical and archaeological research points toward the second interpretation. The barbarian peoples who established kingdoms in the former Western Roman territories were not in general enemies of Roman civilization. Most of them actively wanted to inherit it. They adopted Roman administrative practices, Roman legal frameworks, Roman religious institutions and Roman cultural prestige markers because those things had genuine value and they understood that value. Theodoric the Great, the Ostrogothic king who ruled Italy from 493 to 526 of the Common Era, actively maintained Roman civic culture. He employed Roman administrators, preserved Roman legal traditions and corresponded with the Eastern Roman court in Constantinople in carefully correct Latin. His court minister Cassiodorus produced volumes of official correspondence that are some of the most important documents for understanding the transition from Roman to post-Roman Italy. Theodoric was by any reasonable measure trying to keep Roman civilization going. He just happened to be doing it as a Gothic king rather than a Roman emperor. So who actually destroyed the Roman cities? The honest answer, and I think it is the most important thing I will say in this entire section, is that Rome's cities were not primarily destroyed by external enemies. They were undermined by a combination of internal forces, economic contraction, currency, collapse, plague, administrative overextension, and the slow erosion of the civic culture and institutional capacity that had made those cities function, that had been operating for 2 centuries before the Western Empire officially ended. The barbarian migrations and settlements were in most cases a consequence of Roman weakness rather than its cause. The peoples crossing the Roman frontiers in the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era were themselves often fleeing pressure from further east. The Hunnic expansion that pushed the Goths and others westward was itself a massive displacement event driven by forces originating in Central Asia. The migrations were not simply aggression. They were a cascade of displacement events, each one pushing peoples into the space created by Rome's diminishing capacity to hold its borders. And the cities that fell mostly not at the hands of attackers, but under the weight of their own accumulated vulnerabilities. There is one city I want to use to make this concrete because it illustrates the point almost perfectly. Aquileia in northeastern Italy was in the early imperial period one of the most important cities in the entire Western Roman world. It sat at the head of the Adriatic Sea at the junction of major road and trade routes connecting Italy to the Danube frontier and to the eastern Mediterranean. At its peak in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, its population may have approached 100,000 people. It was Rome's gateway to the east. It was attacked by Attila the Hun in 452 of the Common Era. The siege lasted 3 months. When the city fell, the destruction was severe. Sources describe it as almost total. But here is what the archaeological evidence suggests. Aquileia had already been declining significantly before Attila arrived. The 3rd century economic and military crises had hit the city hard. The population had been falling for generations. The physical scale of the city had contracted. What Attila destroyed was not the Aquileia of the 1st and 2nd centuries at its height. It was a city already diminished, already struggling, already in the process of becoming something smaller and different. The Attila story is real. The destruction was real. But the story of Aquileia's fall begins not in 452, but in 235 or perhaps earlier. Attila did not kill a healthy city. He delivered a final blow to a patient who had already been sick for a very long time. Here is the personal analytical point I want to make, and then I want to move us toward the last pieces of this journey. We have a cultural tendency, and I think it is a deeply human tendency, not specific to any era, to want collapse to have a clear villain. A moment when the bad guys arrived and the good times ended. It is cleaner that way. It is easier to process. It fits the narrative structures we use to make sense of history. But the actual mechanism of civilizational decline is almost never that clean. It is almost always compound. It is almost always the interaction of multiple stresses over extended time, each one reducing resilience, each one making the next stress harder to absorb, until eventually the system reaches a threshold where it can no longer recover from shocks that would have been manageable at an earlier, healthier stage. The barbarians at the gate are real, but the gate was already weakened before they arrived. That is the Roman lesson, and it is not a comfortable one because it means that the question, who destroyed Rome, does not have a satisfying villain to point at. The answer is diffuse systemic and in significant part internal. The Roman cities stopped not because someone outside decided to stop them. They stopped because the conditions that had made them possible, economic, political, demographic, institutional, gradually ceased to exist. And by the time anyone realized how far along the process was, it was already very difficult to reverse. Which brings us to a question that has been lurking underneath this entire journey, and that I want to address directly in the final chapters of our evening together. Because if the cities that stopped were stopped by internal forces as much as external ones, if the real story is about the gradual withdrawal of the conditions that made urban civilization possible, then the equally interesting story is about the cities that did not stop, the ones that survived, the ones that are still here today, transformed beyond recognition, but still standing, still inhabited, still bearing some trace of what Rome built. How did Paris survive when so many other Roman cities did not? Why did Cologne keep going while Aventicum shrank to a village? What was different about the places that made it through, and what does that difference teach us about what makes a city genuinely resilient across centuries of change? That is where we are heading next. And the answers are more interesting and in some cases more surprising than you might expect. Let us talk about the survivors, because here is the thing about studying collapse that nobody warns you about going in. It is genuinely easy to get so absorbed in the cities that failed that you forget to ask the equally important question on the other side of it, which is what saved the ones that made it. We have spent the better part of this evening walking through the wreckage. Pompeii under ash, Timgad under sand, Leptis Magna under the slow, patient weight of centuries without a patron, Londinium under that haunting, dark earth layer of absence and forgetting. And all of that is real and worth sitting with. But the Roman world didn't only produce ruins, it also produced Paris, and Lyon, and Cologne, and Vienna, and a dozen other cities that are still very much alive and inhabited, and full of people going about their Tuesday afternoons with no particular awareness that they are walking on top of 2,000 years of continuous urban history. So what was different about them? What did those cities have that Timgad did not? What did Paris know that Aventicum did not? The answer, it turns out, is several things, and none of them are quite what you would expect. Start with geography, because it is the most fundamental factor and the most underappreciated. The Roman cities that survived the post-Roman transition most successfully were almost without exception cities that sat on genuinely strategic geographical positions, not just strategically important to Rome, but strategically important to any political system that might replace Rome. Locations that would be valuable regardless of who was in charge. Paris is the clearest possible example of this principle in action. The Roman city of Lutetia Parisiorum, Lutetia of the Parisii, the Celtic tribe that had inhabited the island in the Seine before Roman arrival, sat on a natural island in the middle of a major river at the point where the river valley opened into the broader landscape of northern Gaul. The Ile de la Cité, as it is now known, was defensible central and positioned to control river traffic in multiple directions. It was not the largest Roman city in Gaul that was Lugdunum modern Lyon, which we'll come back to shortly, but it had a geographical logic that was essentially eternal. When the Frankish kings who established their dynasty in Gaul, the Merovingians beginning with Clovis I in the late 5th century of the Common Era, were looking for a base of operations, they did not need to be Roman administrators to understand why that island in the Seine was a good place to put a capital. The geography told you. It said here, control this and you control this region. Lutetia had a Roman forum, Roman baths, the remains of which still stand today as the Therme de Cluny, in the heart of the Latin Quarter, and if you have ever visited Paris and walked past those ancient Roman walls, rising unexpectedly between medieval streets and modern cafes, you know what I mean about history lying very close to the surface in that city. Roman roads radiating outward in multiple directions. The Franks did not demolish any of it. They used it. They built on top of it, around it, beside it. The city continued without interruption because the reasons to be there never went away. Lugdunum Lyon is an even more instructive case because it was actually the capital of the three Gauls, as the Romans called their Gallic provinces, and one of the most important cities in the entire Western Roman world. At its peak, Lugdunum had a population of perhaps 50,000 to 80,000 people. It was the site of a significant imperial mint, a major administrative centre, and a city of genuine cultural importance. The Emperor Claudius himself was born there. It had an extraordinary water supply system with 4 separate aqueducts, bringing water from distances of up to 75 kilometres away, one of the most sophisticated water infrastructure projects in the Roman West. By the 5th century of the Common Era, the Burgundians had established control over the region. And here is what happened, which I think is genuinely remarkable. The transition was in many respects remarkably smooth. The Roman senatorial aristocracy of Lugdunum did not disappear. They adapted. They married into Burgundian noble families. They continued to serve as administrators, lawyers, and bishops in the new political order. They used their education, their Latin, their knowledge of Roman law and governance as assets in negotiating their position in the post-Roman world. A man named Sidonius Apollinaris, a Gallo-Roman aristocrat poet, and eventually Bishop of Clermont in the mid-5th century, left behind a remarkable collection of letters that show us in unusually vivid detail exactly what this transition looked like from the inside. He hosted Visigothic kings at dinner. He wrote poetry in classical Latin meters while living in a world that was rapidly becoming something Rome would not have recognized. He was simultaneously deeply Roman and deeply practical about the new realities he was navigating. That flexibility, that capacity to maintain Roman cultural identity while adapting to new political circumstances is one of the key reasons Lyon survived when other cities did not. Its elite knew how to be useful to whoever was in charge. That is not cynicism. That is the most ancient and reliable form of institutional resilience. Now, here is the factor I want to spend the most time on because I think it is the most underestimated force in the survival of Roman cities across the transition to the medieval world: the Christian Church. Bear with me for a moment because this is genuinely important and genuinely interesting regardless of your personal feelings about organized religion. We are talking about institutional history here, not theology. When the Roman administrative system in the western provinces weakened and eventually collapsed, it left behind a vacuum. Administrative vacuums do not stay empty. Something fills them, and in city after city across the post-Roman West, the institution that filled the vacuum, that maintained records, that organized poor relief, that negotiated with incoming peoples, that preserved literacy and legal knowledge, that gave the surviving urban population a reason to remain gathered in one place, was the local Christian bishop and the church community around him. Think about what a bishop actually was in a major Roman city of the 4th and 5th centuries. He was the head of an institution that owned significant property. He presided over the only large-scale organized charitable operation in the city, feeding the poor, caring for the sick, burying the dead. He had a trained administrative staff clergy who could read, write, and keep records at a time when literacy was becoming increasingly rare. He had regular access to the entire urban population who gathered in his basilica on a weekly basis. When the Roman governor left or was killed or simply stopped being replaced, the bishop was often the most powerful and best organized person left in the city. And bishops, unlike Roman governors who rotated through assignments, were local. They were from the city. They knew the people. They had relationships with the incoming Frankish or Visigothic or Burgundian leaders, because those leaders were increasingly Christian themselves and wanted the legitimacy that episcopal approval could provide. Cologne, the Roman city of Colonia Agrippina, named for Agrippina the Younger, the mother of the Emperor Nero who was actually born there, is one of the most striking examples of this episcopal continuity. The city had a bishop from at least the early 4th century of the Common Era, and even as the political control of the Rhine region shifted from Roman to Frankish hands in the 5th century, the episcopal institution provided an unbroken thread of organized civic life. The Cathedral of Cologne sits today on the same site where the Roman governor's palace once stood, and where a Christian church has stood continuously since roughly the 4th century. That is 1700 years of unbroken institutional presence in a single location. The church did not just preserve cities physically. It preserved the idea of what a city was. It maintained the administrative habits, the literacy, the legal frameworks, and the sense of permanent-rooted community that Roman urban culture had produced. It was in a very real sense the operating system that kept running after the hardware had been replaced. There is a third factor in the survival of Roman cities that I want to mention, and it is more subtle, but I think equally important. The cities that survived tended to be the ones that had genuine deep roots of local identity that existed alongside and underneath their Roman identity, rather than being entirely dependent on it. Cologne had been the tribal capital of the Ubi before Rome arrived. Lyon sat at the confluence of the Rhone and Saône rivers, a location that had been a gathering and trading place for Celtic peoples long before a Roman legionary named Lucius Munatius Plancus founded the Roman colony there in 43 years before the Common Era. Paris, as we noted, was the territory of the Parisii. Vienna, the Roman Vindobona, where the Emperor Marcus Aurelius died in 180 of the Common Era, sat at a Danube crossing that had been strategically important to the Celtic and Germanic peoples of the region for centuries before Rome arrived. These cities had a reason to exist that predated Rome and would outlast Rome. They were not created by Rome. They were amplified by Rome, organized and institutionalized by Rome, given their physical form by Rome. But the underlying logic of their location belonged to a deeper geography that did not care which civilization was currently in charge. Compare that to Timgad laid out on a featureless plain for purely military logistical reasons with no pre-Roman settlement, no natural geographical advantage that would make it important to any post-Roman political order. When Roman military logic ceased to apply, Timgad had nothing left to anchor it. The reason for its existence had been entirely imported, and when the importer left, the reason left with it. Let me give you one more example that I find particularly moving because it captures the whole story in miniature. The city of Augusta Treverorum, modern Trier, in what is now Western Germany near the Luxembourg border, was one of the most important cities in the late Roman Empire. In the 4th century of the Common Era, it served as an imperial residence, a major administrative capital, and the base from which several emperors governed the western provinces. At its peak, it may have had a population of 80,000 to 100,000 people, making it one of the largest cities north of the Alps. It had an imperial palace, a massive basilica, the Aula Palatina, which still stands today as one of the best preserved Roman buildings in northern Europe, an amphitheatre, extensive public baths and city walls, whose gates are still standing after 17 centuries. The city went through significant turbulence in the 5th century, changing hands between Roman, Frankish and other powers multiple times. Its population fell sharply from its imperial heights, but it never fully emptied. The episcopal institution maintained continuity. The geographical position on the Moselle River retained its importance. The physical fabric of the city, those extraordinary walls and gates and the giant basilica rising above the medieval rooftops, was simply too substantial to disappear. Today, Trier is a city of approximately 115,000 people. It has a UNESCO World Heritage designation covering its Roman monuments, and standing in the Aula Palatina, a vast brick hall built by the Emperor Constantine I in the early 4th century of the Common Era, its walls still soaring to 29 metres, its apse still intact, you feel in a way that is genuinely difficult to articulate what it means for a place to have simply refused to stop. So what is the pattern? What did Paris, Lyon, Cologne, Vienna, Trier have that Timgad and Aventicum and so many others did not? Geography that transcended any single political system. Institutional continuity provided in most cases by the Christian Church that bridged the gap between the Roman world and the medieval one. Local roots of identity and economic logic that existed independently of Roman patronage. And this one is harder to quantify, but I believe it is real, a density of accumulated investment, both physical and human, that simply made abandonment more costly than adaptation. The cities that survived were not necessarily the best planned or the most beautifully built, They were the ones most deeply embedded in the landscape and the human patterns of their regions. They were the ones where the answer to the question, "Why is this city here?" had multiple answers layered over each other across centuries, none of which depended entirely on Rome remaining in charge. Resilience, it turns out, looks less like granite and more like roots. The deeper they go and the more directions they spread, the harder the tree is to knock down. We're almost at the end of our journey now. Almost. We have one last stop to make. And this one brings us back to where we started, back to the question underneath all the questions. Not, how did Rome's cities stop? We have answered that in a dozen different ways tonight. Not, which cities survived and why. We have just walked through that. The last question is the one that reaches across 2,000 years and lands quietly but directly on our own doorstep. What do the ruins of Rome still have to say to us? What are those stones in the Algerian desert and the Moroccan foothills and the Libyan coastline and the buried streets of modern London still trying to tell us if we are willing to stand still long enough to listen? That is where we finish. And I think if you have come this far with me tonight, you already know some of what the answer is going to be. But let us say it out loud anyway. Let us give it the ending it deserves. So, here we are. The last stop on a journey that has taken us through volcanic ash and desert sand, through economic collapse and epidemic grief, through the slow withdrawal of empires, and the stubborn persistence of communities that refused to let go of who they were. We have walked the buried streets of Pompeii, stood in the shadow of Timgad's impossible arch, followed the fading footsteps of Londinium's last Roman residents, and sat quietly with the people of Volubilis, holding their Latin inscriptions long after the world that gave them meaning had moved on. And now I want to do something slightly different for this final chapter. I want to step back from the individual cities and ask the question that all of them collectively have been building toward. What does it actually mean when a civilization ends? Not in the political sense, not the dates and the treaties and the last emperors with their undignified endings, but in the human sense, in the sense of what it feels like from the inside to be living through the last days of something enormous without knowing they are the last days. And then, because I think this is the most important part, what do the ruins still have left to teach us? Let me start with a detail that has been sitting quietly in the back of my mind since the very beginning of this journey, and that I have been saving for exactly this moment. In the ruins of Duga, a remarkably well-preserved Roman city in what is now northern Tunisia, designated a World Heritage Site by UNESCO, in 1997, built on a hillside overlooking a wide fertile valley, there is a public latrine. I realise that is not the most poetic opening sentence. Bear with me. The public latrine of Duga is not famous the way the Colosseum is famous or the Pantheon is famous, but it is in its own quiet way one of the most extraordinary spaces in the Roman world. It is a large semicircular room, its stone seats arranged in a continuous curve around three walls, with channels running beneath, and a small fountain in the centre, because Romans, being Romans, apparently felt that even communal bathroom visits should involve a degree of aesthetic consideration. The seats are worn smooth, not from the archaeological process of centuries of weathering, worn smooth from use, from the accumulated weight of thousands of ordinary human beings sitting there over the course of the city's life, talking, probably the way people do when they are in an unavoidably social situation, discussing the price of grain or the latest news from Rome, or whether the chariot races last week were as good as the ones the season before. Those grooves in the stone are not historical artifact in the way that a mosaic or a triumphal arch is a historical artifact. They are something more intimate than that. They are the physical record of ordinary life, of the unremarkable, uncelebrated daily reality, of people who had no idea they would one day be the subject of a 12-part history narration listened to by someone thousands of years in the future, probably lying in bed in the dark. Hello, by the way, if that is you right now. Here is the thing about Roman ruins that I think gets missed in most of the standard historical narratives. We treat them as evidence of greatness, as proof of what civilization can achieve, and they are that the engineering, the art, the urban planning, the sheer ambition of building cities in deserts and on islands at the edge of the known world is genuinely extraordinary and deserves the admiration it receives. But they are also, and I think this is equally important, evidence of ordinariness, of the fact that the people who lived in those cities were underneath all the marble and the aqueducts just people. They had mortgages, more or less. They worried about their children. They had neighbours they liked and neighbours they could not stand. They complained about the weather and the politicians and the cost of living. They fell in love and fell out of it. They made plans that did not work out. They had better days and worse days. The graffiti found on the walls of Pompeii, and there is an enormous amount of it preserved under the ash, with the same indiscriminate democracy that the eruption applied to everything else, is perhaps the most vivid evidence of this ordinariness. There are election endorsements. There are declarations of love. There are insults directed at specific named individuals, some of which are quite creative, and most of which I cannot repeat in full. There is a wall near the forum that records a series of dice game scores. There is a drawing of a gladiator. There is declaration apparently sincere that someone named Restituta makes men's heads spin. Restituta has been gone for 2,000 years. Her name is still on a wall in Pompeii. What is history if not that? Let me bring in the cities that were not Roman now, because I want to make a comparative point that I think deepens the lesson. In the American Midwest, there is a city called Detroit. At its peak in the 1950s, Detroit had a population of approximately 1,800,000 people. It was the manufacturing capital of the most powerful industrial economy the world had ever seen. It had extraordinary architecture, a thriving cultural scene, a middle class of remarkable breadth and prosperity. It was, in the language of its era, a great city. By 2013, when the city filed for the largest municipal bankruptcy in United States history, its population had fallen to approximately 700,000. Entire neighbourhoods had been formally demolished by the city government because there were not enough residents to occupy them. The ruins of abandoned factories and empty apartment blocks had become somewhat surreally tourist attractions. I am not drawing a direct equivalence between Detroit and a Roman city. The scales are different, the time frames are different, the causes are different in their specifics. Detroit's decline is driven by the collapse of a single industry, by suburbanization, by racial inequality, by a dozen specific American circumstances that have no precise Roman parallel. But the mechanism and urban economy built around a specific set of conditions, those conditions changing the city, struggling to adapt fast enough population, declining infrastructure becoming impossible to maintain at its original scale, that mechanism is recognizable across 2,000 years without any difficulty at all. And Detroit, unlike Timgad, has the advantage of existing in a time when we understand what is happening while it is happening. We have the historical record of Rome to consult. We have the evidence of what worked and what did not, what saved cities and what allowed them to fade, stretching back across 2 millennia. The question is whether we use it. There is a Roman thinker whose words have been following me throughout this entire journey, and I want to share them with you now because I think they are among the most quietly devastating observations any ancient writer left behind. The historian Livy, writing in the early years of the Roman Empire, probably sometime between 27 years before the Common Era and 17 of the Common Era opened his enormous history of Rome with a preface that contains this observation. He wrote, roughly translated, that what makes the study of history valuable is that you can see clearly set out the evidence of every kind of behaviour and its consequences. From that evidence you can choose what to imitate and what to avoid. Livy believed that history was at its core a practical guide to living, not a collection of entertaining stories about dead people, a manual for the present written in the ink of the past. He wrote those words at the beginning of an empire that would within a few centuries demonstrate exactly the patterns he was describing: the currency debasement, the overextension, the epidemic vulnerability of dense urban populations, the slow erosion of civic institutions, the way external pressures become fatal when internal resilience has already been depleted. All of it was there to be seen if anyone had been looking closely enough. Whether anyone was looking closely enough is, of course, one of the great open questions of Roman history. Here is my personal conclusion after everything we have walked through tonight. And I want to be clear that this is opinion, not settled historical fact. It is the interpretation I have arrived at after a long time sitting with these stories, and you are entirely free to disagree with it. I think the most important thing the ruins of Rome are still whispering is not about power or engineering or the achievements of civilization. Those things are real and worth celebrating, but they are not the deepest message. The deepest message, I think, is about the danger of assuming permanence. The Romans built for the ages. Literally, they used the phrase ad perpetuum re memoriam, for the eternal memory of the thing in their inscriptions, with what seems in retrospect like almost poignant regularity. They built in stone and concrete because they intended their buildings to last. They organized their cities around the assumption that the systems sustaining those cities would continue indefinitely. They made long-term investments in infrastructure and institutions in the education of their children on the reasonable assumption that the world their children would inherit would broadly resemble the world they themselves lived in. That assumption was not irrational. For long stretches of Roman history it was entirely justified. The Pax Romana, roughly 2 centuries of relative peace and prosperity in the Mediterranean world, was one of the most sustained periods of urban flourishing in human history. If you were born in Rome in the year 100 of the Common Era, you had very good reason to believe that the world you were born into was solid, lasting, and improving. The ruins are the evidence of what happened when that assumption turned out to be wrong. Not all at once, not catastrophically in a single moment, but gradually and then faster still, until the cities that had seemed eternal were empty, and the stones that had been meant to last forever were being quarried by farmers to build walls for their sheep. This is not a counsel of despair. I want to be clear about that. The story of Rome is not simply a tragedy. It is also a story of extraordinary human resilience of communities that adapted, of institutions that bent without breaking, of cities that found ways to survive in changed circumstances and carry something essential of the old world into the new one. Paris exists, Lyon exists, Vienna exists. The Catholic Church exists, carrying Roman administrative structures and Latin legal vocabulary into the 21st century in ways that most people never think to notice. Rome did not end, it transformed, messily, unevenly, with enormous loss and enormous continuity simultaneously. That is how things actually end when they end. Not with a clean line, but with a long, complicated, contested transition that historians are still arguing about 1500 years later. And the ruins themselves let us end there because they deserve it. There is something specific that happens when you stand in an ancient Roman ruin, and I have been trying to find the right words for it throughout this entire journey. It is not sadness exactly, though sadness is part of it. It is not awe, though awe is part of it too. I think it is recognition. Standing in the Forum of Pompeii, or looking out over the Sahara from the steps of Timgad's capital temple, or placing your hand on the sun-warmed stones of Leptis Magna's colonnaded street, you feel, if you let yourself feel it, not the distance between yourself and the people who built these things. You feel the proximity, the closeness of it, the fact that the hands that laid these stones were attached to bodies that felt cold in winter, and hungry before dinner, and nervous about things that mattered to them, and delighted by small, unexpected pleasures. The same hands as yours, more or less. These same hearts give or take 2,000 years of history, and those people built something extraordinary, and it lasted, and it mattered, and then it stopped. And the stopping was not the end of the story, because the story does not have an end. It just keeps changing shape, generation after generation, all the way down to tonight, all the way down to you lying in the dark with the history of a vanished world in your ears. Remember Restituta, who made men's heads spin, and whose name is still on a wall in Pompeii. Remember the baker Modestus and his 81 loaves. Remember the family in the garden of Timgad who carved that inscription about hunting and bathing and laughing, about what a good life actually looks like, and then went on with their days without any knowledge that 2,000 years later people would still be reading their words and thinking, yes, that sounds about right. Those are the people history is made of. Not just the emperors and the generals and the architects. The ordinary, remarkable, irreplaceable people who woke up every morning inside a civilization they had not built and could not fully understand, and simply did their best with the time and the place they had been given, just like us. Thank you. Genuinely. If you have been here with me for this entire journey through 12 chapters across 5 continents of the Roman world, from the ash of Vesuvius to the sand of the Sahara, to the cold grey shores of Roman Britain, thank you for staying. Thank you for caring about these stories. Thank you for being the kind of person who finds meaning in ruins and in the lives of people who've been gone for a very long time. History is not a subject, it is a conversation across time. And every time someone listens to one of these stories, the people who lived them become just a little less forgotten. That matters. I believe it genuinely matters. If this journey moved you in some way, if some part of it surprised you or made you think differently about something, or just kept you company for a little while tonight, consider sharing it with someone else who might feel the same way. Leave a comment below with the city or the story that stayed with you most. I read everyone, and I am always genuinely curious which details land differently for different people. And if you want to keep going, if you want more nights like this, more stories from the deep past, more questions that refuse to stay ancient, then stay close. Because the next story is already waiting. It is a good one, I promise. Now get some rest. The ruins will still be there in the morning.